Thank you. Good afternoon from Cleveland, Ohio. Welcome to the third session of Inviting Biodiversity into Our Gardens, a five-part symposium geared towards transforming green spaces into habitat worthy of supporting native species. I am Renee Barranca, the Manager of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. At the Land Conservancy, I plan nature-based programming for people of all ages, utilizing the expansive network of conservation properties the Land Conservancy has protected in Northeast Ohio, which totals close to 70,000 acres of natural landscapes, family farms, and urban green spaces. My co-hosts for this symposium are Ann Cicerella of the Cleveland Pollinator and Native Plant Symposium and Judy Simrock from Nature Spark. Ann is the founder of the Cleveland Pollinator and Native Plant Symposium, which debuted in 2015 with Doug Tallamy as its keynote speaker. Her goal was, and still is, to inspire conversations about the importance of restoring our increasingly fragmented native habitats, starting with our own backyards and local community plots of land. Judy Simrock started Nature Spark to continue her work with students and adults in the realm of nature education and exploration. She conducts biological field inventories and property surveys, and she loves to share her passion for nature through field trips and public programs, both virtually and in person. We have joined forces to bring you national and regional experts to increase our knowledge about pollinators, native plants, and planting designs that are robust and form ecologically valuable gardens and natural areas. Our sessions are geared towards helping gardeners, landscape architects, natural resource managers, and many more create a network of functioning habitats that benefit pollinators and native wildlife species. Join us in 2 weeks for session 4, Nature Connections, Creating Functional Ecosystems in Urban Settings. That's on February 23rd, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Details about this event can be found on Western Reserve Land Conservancy's website, and we'll drop a link to register in the chat. I encourage you to explore our website and learn more about our efforts to conserve and protect nature in our region. I want to take a moment to recognize and thank our sponsors who have made it possible for us to bring you these programs for free. Thank you to the Ohio Division of Wildlife, Cleveland Metro Parks, Scioto Gardens, Biodiversity Landscape Design, Big Creek Connects, the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership for Biodiversity, Natives in Harmony, Sierra Club of Northeast Ohio, Avonlea Gardens, and Powell's Native Wildflowers. It's a reminder to please use the Q&A feature to post your questions, and we will pause for a few questions if time permits following each presentation. And lastly, take a moment and add your city and state to the chat. We'd love to see where you're joining us from today. Now on to our show. It's my pleasure to introduce Tim Boland. Tim is the Executive Director of the Poly Hill Arboretum on Martha's Vineyard. His talk is titled The American Oak, Diversity, Ecology, and Identification. Welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen.
You bet.
I'm going to attempt to, and there it is. And here it is.
Awesome. Looks good.
I'm just thrilled, Renee, to be part of this and everybody else who's joining us from all over the place, which I think is very cool. I'm going to move this down here so I can see. And I want to thank you, Renee and Ann, and all the sponsors today. It's really remarkable. I looked at your collection of speakers in the last couple weeks and upcoming. It's really a dynamic group. Not me, but yes, all the others. Anyway, I want to get started by just thanking you all. And I have been involved with oaks for a long time. I'll describe my introduction. I've been a grower, a curator, and now I'm an administrator. And in my various roles, for the most part, I've been learning more and more about oaks throughout my life. But as a grower, I was interested in growing oaks for the campus at Michigan State University. I'm actually from Grand Rapids, Michigan, originally went to school at MSU. And I was down in the herbarium, which is a place where they have flat dried specimens of plants. And I was looking at oak specimens, and I was down there and I was trying to discover where I could collect seed acorns of oaks to grow for the campus Arboretum. And while I was down there, I had simultaneously had just started a graduate school program in plant taxonomy, plant ecology, and evolution. And the curator was down there and he looked at me and he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm looking at oaks. And he said, well, I hate oaks. I was like, wow, I've never heard that before. But Dr. Pinero went on to describe his work, which was actually involved with the Flora of Oaxaca, which is in a southern state in Mexico. And through a more of an association with him, I ended up doing my master's degree looking at a small area of Oaxaca, which has over 11,000 species of plants, which you can imagine is kind of amazing. So I went to Oaxaca and studied oaks with him for about 3 weeks and did my master's degree on that. But later, as I became a curator at the Morton Arboretum, and then later here at Poly Hill, I discovered that oaks are incredibly valuable as ecological components. In fact, the most valuable shade tree in North America and genus of species in terms of the associated life forms that coexist with oaks. So today I'm going to go through some of the oaks and some of their relationships. I'll hit on some of the identification features, but for the most part, I'm not going to get into the tedium of what makes an oak species different from each other because I have a lot to cover. So let's get going. And as far as the world goes, how many oaks are there? Well, currently there are 430 species of oaks that we recognize today. They have a worldwide distribution that's primarily temperate. And what I mean by that, they occur in areas that have distinct seasonal changes. So we're in winter now, spring, summer, fall. But there are oaks that are in subtropical and tropical areas. The majority of them are actually temperate, as I described them. But they go down into Mexico, which is the highest species diversity in the world, and they go over into Asia. And I'll talk a little bit about those oaks, but today the focus is on primarily North American oaks and Midwestern oaks. So there is a handout that we'll put in the chat at the end that will list all of these resources that you can go to, so you don't have to try to write down all the links and things I share. But the Flora of North America, which is a published series of volumes on the flora, one of the earliest volumes, I think it's volume 3. I may be wrong there, but I think it is. It has Quercus in it, the genus, and it's authored by Dr. Kevin Nixon, and it has these beautiful keys and illustrations of oaks in North America. And you can go to this online and learn more about North American oaks. Dr. Nixon at Cornell helped me with my Mexican oak research and is an expert of that group, amongst others. If we look at them in North America, north of Mexico, there's 91 species. And then Mexico, as I mentioned, has 160 species. Some of these bleed over from Texas, obviously, and in California, some of the species. Asia has 120 or more species, and they're very diverse and beautiful. We have some growing here at the Poly Hill Arboretum. There's a website called Oaks of the World. If you really want to go on an oak hunt, it's a fabulous display of oaks around the world. Nearly all 430 are documented there. As far as North America goes, and some of my work here at Poly Hill is with native oaks of North America. So California, if you've been out to California, they have 20 species. They're just incredible. I think you're aware of the fires that are going on in California, and they've really hit a lot of the oak species of California. They're drought deciduous oaks, like many of them in Mexico. When it gets super hot, they shed their leaves. They're not completely evergreen, although some are in Mexico and California. Southeastern North America is where I do a lot of work. I was in the Panhandle last year, working exclusively on 2 oak species that are down in the Panhandle. There's some that are endangered, and we're working to map them and grow them. Texas, the Edwards Plateau, if you ever get a chance to go there, you should. The species diversity, there's 50 species. All these are cataloged in the Flora of North America and that website I mentioned, Oaks of America. Let's talk about identification just very quickly. The 2 groups we're looking at in North America predominantly, there's 3 altogether, but the 2 we're looking at is the white oak group. It's known as the section quercus. They have leaves that are lobed or toothed, but without bristle tips, which is very important in identification. They have acorns that mature in the autumn of the first year. So if you're collecting acorns the first year they flower, they produce an acorn at the end of the year from spring flowering over the summer. That's different in the red oak group, which I'll talk about. The nut kernels are relatively sweet, and so the animals favor the white oak group, section quercus, in terms of eating them. Very, very much they're a food source. The inner surface of the acorn cup, which is called the cupule, has no hairs or is glabrous. And you'll notice the difference with this group, which is the red, sometimes referred to as black oak group, lobate. Now the leaves here are variously lobed and toothed, but they have bristle tips, little tips on the end. And that's a major difference. The acorns mature in the second season. So you have spring flowering, and it goes to fall. And if you look at the spot on the twig where the flowers have emerged, they're pollinated, and you can see little micro acorns. They take yet another full season to the following autumn to produce the entire acorn. These acorns are different though. The kernels are relatively bitter. They're full of a chemical called tannins, and the tannins as a group are very, very bitter. They're used to tan leather. You've probably heard of that. The inner surface of the acorn cup is hairy. You can see this normally without a hand lens, but if you have a hand lens, you'll see that inner surface is hairy. So that's kind of just the easy breakdown. Between the species of the black oak group in particular, it's super hard sometimes to tell them apart by their leaves. So it's kind of a whole tree that you have to look at. Here it is kind of illustrated, no bristle tips. This is Quercus alba, the white oak, which we'll talk about. Here are the bristle tips we talked about in the red oak group. Both have these etched out leaves, which are called a sinus. You can see the sinus here that are deep. So that's kind of just the very simple difference. But the flowers are very curious. They are not insect pollinated. That's one thing for you to know. They're wind pollinated. So there's no reason that they have big colorful petals or interior petals or even pollen that is that attractive to insects. And in fact, you see here on the right, I have my cursor there, the sticky, what they call stigmatic surfaces, the female portion. The pollen, which is produced in grains and is wind dispersed, lands on those, and then the acorn process starts. But see how tiny they are? They're very sticky as well. And they're in the axils of these vegetative buds. Here's what the male flower looks like, and it's a catkin. Birch trees and other trees, Carpinus and others have these long stringy catkins, which are male inflorescences. So they have separate male and female flowers, and they have these stamens that release pollen in abundance. So here on Martha's Vineyard, our oak canopy, our oak woodlands are 90%. They dominate the island. So I moved to the right place. Although one of the cruel twist of fates for me is I'm allergic to oak pollen. So you'll actually have on your car as you drive just this kind of yellow sheen of pollen, which is really kind of hard on the nasal passages. So I'm a big fan of Claritin and other things just to get through the season. Oaks live in close company, mainly because they're wind pollinated, but I should say Sometimes, but not always, but mostly in the South, and certainly here on Martha's Vineyard, where you have droughty sands or kind of drought forest on sandy gravel, they're often growing in association with pines. So here, the pine trees is Pinus rigida, the pitch pine that grows all over the island, and it too flowers at about the same time, mid-May. So you have it both coming at you, the pine and the oak pollen. The acorn is so curious and so cool on oaks, the fruit type. And there's been a lot of studies trying to figure out from an evolutionary perspective, and then also from a cellular perspective, how it forms. So the cupule, which is the acorn cup, is believed to be a fusing over time, evolutionary time, of stem axes into kind of this enclosure. And here you see it developing over time, and then it kind of surrounds the actual embryo acorn of the oak. And then here it is at full maturation. You have the styler end right here where the stigmas were, which I showed you, that collect the pollen, and here it is here. And then you have the acorn and the cupule, which is scaled to different degrees and is also a key identification feature for acorns and oaks and oak species between the groups. They're very, very cool if you look at them from a worldwide perspective. So some of the acorns and the cupules in Asia, for instance, in Borneo and the Himalayas, here's one from Tibet, it's Quercus lamellosa. Here's one from Malaysia called Flora. Some of the oaks that you may know in a kind of distance way, this is Quercus suber. The bark of this tree, which is a Mediterranean tree and Eurasian tree, is the source of cork. And that's what that looks like. We have this tree, Quercus variabilis, here at Polly Hill with this fringed acorn cup. We collected this in the acorn of it in the Ozarks, the overcup oak, Quercus lyrata. So you can see these are just really cool in their diversity and structure. They're very artistic and wonderful. This particular one is entirely around the acorn. Well, for a plant propagator, and I do spend a lot of time collecting acorns all over the place, the acorn weevil, some say it's evil. It's not actually, it's just one of the many faunistic connections of animals and insects to oaks and their codependency. It's a native insect and it lays its eggs inside the acorn. And if you are collecting acorns, the best case scenario is you can collect them right off of the tree. As they lay on the ground, they're more vulnerable to acorn weevil. In general, they can be attacked in both places, but it's more likely if they sat on the ground. It lays its eggs inside the acorn, a worm hatches, and it starts to eat the interior of the acorn, rendering it useless for the most part. Let's look at some oaks, and I do want to go through these very quickly, but these are oaks that are in and around you, and I'll point out some of the special features, but I'm not going to dwell on any too long because we're short on time. But the Midwest is full of wonderful oaks, many more than just 12. In fact, in parts of the Midwest, depending on what you consider the Midwest, you'll see places in Missouri and others that have 40 plus oaks, maybe more than that. But let's look at these two groups that are broken down into the white oak section and the red oak section. There's a book that's online now, which I encourage you to get and look at. A lot of the photos from this book are in my talk are in this book. You can see this in the reference sheet with all the links that I mentioned earlier, and Renee is going to post that for you. But it's a terrific book by the USDA, the Forest Service, and needs to be updated, but it's really wonderful. The white oak is a favorite, though. It is the longest living species oak in North America. Oak trees going up to 600 years of age. It has a distinct lobation, rounded lobes, these kind of chalky terminal buds. All oaks have terminal buds and a very elegant kind of acorn that you see here and the bark. I'll talk about a feature of the bark that's kind of cool in a little bit. Here's the distribution though. If you're going to grow an oak from an acorn, you should collect it from its local locale. So if you're in Ohio, you should try to stay within 1 to 200 miles of the location in a general sense to get a pre-adapted tree. But it has beautiful lobes, as I mentioned, in a wide distribution down into the panhandle. There's a little comment down here about the Oak and Oak State Park in Maryland, and I saw the tree there. It was about 480 years old, I believe, and it exploded in 2002 from just old age, but it was a magnificent tree. So the longest living species oak. Here's some photos of it. I had the pleasure of leading a dendrological group in 2004 through the Ozarks and Southern Illinois looking at big oaks. This is Quercus alba. This goes back to 1755. Oops, let's see. And here's a tree in Hazlet, Michigan, not far from where I'm from. Beautiful white oak with a wraparound driveway. Here on Martha's Vineyard, they leaf out kind of late because we have a late spring. I'm not sure if it's the acidic soils that we have. We have very acidic soils, but they leaf out with this kind of pinkish tone. They have the flowers leafing out, or I should say coming out at the same time. And here are the stamens kind of showing their yellow, almost kind of a lime color before they open on these catkins. They have beautiful fall color often, kind of a burnished red or orange. So it's one of the oaks in the white oak groups that has the best fall color. Here's one in Carpenter Nature Reserve in Southern Illinois that's 450 years old. One thing about the white oak group, predominantly more than the black oak group, they have this gray patching that you sometimes see where the ridges of the bark are kind of eaten away by a fungus, and that's called gray patch. It's a parasitoid kind of fungus that lives on the tree, but doesn't do anything negative to the tree. So I'm not even sure it's more of a form of mutualism. It's very common on white oak. Here's a tree on Martha's Vineyard. I live in a place that has hurricane force winds. October 30th of this year, we had 94-mile-an-hour winds here. The white oaks are less susceptible to breakage, which I'll talk about a little bit later, than the black oaks that are here on the island, but they don't grow that tall here because of the winds. So they grow like this, kind of horizontal with these massive branch structures. This is a big tree that's exposed. The ocean is about 1.5 miles away, so it gets blasted by the winds. Here's one in an extreme that is down by the coast. White oak is not tolerant of salt where black oak is. So this is a white oak. There's the water. You can see a pond, and over this beach line is the Atlantic Ocean. So this guy, it's Quercus alba, is getting horizontal, as we say. So it's fighting. In the Midwest and in many places where Native Americans have associations much longer than we have, they have formed these trail markers where they bent over trees. They'd use stones primarily to arc trees to create a trail marker. And they would have a series of these so people were aware of what trail to follow. And these go back, of course, a couple hundred years or more. So it's kind of cool to see these. This is in Athens, Illinois. An oak that I really like and plays a terrific role in the future of planting oaks, and that's swamp white oak. Similar to white oak, but grows in swamps, hence the name. It has an acorn with this long, what they call peduncle here on the fruit. It has these twigs that are kind of exfoliating. The leaf is quite different. It's kind of obovate, and undersides of the leaf, swamp Quercus bicolor, is because of the bicolor of the leaf. This is a very curious oak. Here's the twigs with these kind of yellow terminal buds. It's planted in urban situations, which I'll explain why in a moment. You can see that same patch, gray patch I mentioned, This is a beautiful array of trees at the Scott Arboretum of Swarthmore College at Quercus bicolor, planted originally by the Quakers there in the mid 1800s. And they've maintained this grand planting all the way up to their administration building. If you look at them in the wild, though, you'll see they're very different. This is one in a cultivated collection. This is a younger tree, probably about 25 years old. But in nature, you'll see them in swamps or what we would call seasonally wet areas. Trees like this, particularly oak trees, have a little bit different root system when they're from wet areas. Instead of kind of having more of a fleshy root system, they have more of a kind of a fibrous root system. So trees that can survive these anaerobic conditions can also survive anaerobic conditions where street trees are planted. So pin oak and Quercus bicolor are two trees that are often used as root stocks for grafting trees. You put them in a city treescape with terrible compacted soils, and they seem to be able to take it. And it's because of this adaptive root system. In New England, it's very curious. My work also involves doing the flora of Dukes County, which includes the two islands of Martha's Vineyard here, and this is Nantucket. They're our rival. We have to have a rival close by. But Quercus bicolor follows a pattern of our flora where the lower Cape has Quercus bicolor, but the outer Cape in Nantucket has it, but for some reason it's escaped us. And so we don't have it. Here it is down here. It's on Cape Cod and on Nantucket, but somehow this lower projection, we have the same geology as this. So it never quite settled here. A tree that reminds me of my old job at Michigan State, where I had a nursery that was about 30 acres and it had 6 or 7 residual or remnant Quercus macrocarpa, Bur Oaks on the property. Bur Oak is very curious. It grows both in swampy areas and in high and dry areas, particularly limestone areas. That George Ware used to call it has ecological amplitude. He was a dendrologist at the Morton Arboretum that introduced me to that term. And he said, no, it's actually a tree that can handle both. So it's very valuable. The Bur Acorn is really cool. It's got this cap, which I have some from Texas. I'll show you in a moment. It has, similar to bicolor, a little bit of kind of rigid twigs on older twigs. And then it has a habit like this, where it has kind of a shiny epidermis, which is a sign of drought tolerance. So you look for oaks that have that waxy epidermal covering as a sign of drought tolerance. Here's a giant tree down in Illinois. Beautiful, beautiful, wide spreading tree. Just it's the prairie sentinel of the Midwest. Oops. And here is an acorn from Texas that a friend sent me, which is kind of amazing to see the size of the cupule. This is a Bur Oak from Texas. I've seen some from Missouri like this. Here's the actual nut. It's kind of cool and crazy that they get this big. Another shot of the Bur Oak in Illinois, just a massive spreading tree. They do have, over time, I mentioned this kind of almost like liquid ambar, sweet gum kind of twigs. A tree that does grow in Ohio, and you may or may not be familiar with it, rarely planted as an ornamental plant or a street tree, is post oak. On Martha's Vineyard, it reaches its northernmost maximum, goes over into Massachusetts and parts of New York. It's a very, very drought tolerant tree. There are thousands of acres of it in Texas and in Oklahoma, where it really reaches its point of greatest happiness. It has this really interesting leaf, which is called a wasp waist, very indented. Look at the waxes on this thing. It is a tree that can really take drought. Here you can see it. This doesn't show the shiny leaf, but it's a tough tree. I have a grove of 5 of these in my yard. Really amazing. On Martha's Vineyard, there are these ancient stools, which are trees that have been cut by the native inhabitants of Martha's Vineyard before the European colonists have came, and then after the colonists that came. We are early in our settlement here, 1602. But before that, the Wampanoag tribe, and then, certainly the Europeans that came to the island harvested these trees for firewood. So they persist as these stool mounds. They're clonal, so they sprout, and they're believed to be, after being harvested 3 or 4 times, about 300 to 400 years of age. So oaks can have an ancient root system as well as a top like this. Here's a group of white oaks that have what I mentioned, those kind of interesting and indented leaves, and you might think they're a red oak with pointed bristles, but they're not. They're just kind of have these pointed lobes, but they don't have bristle tips. One that I absolutely love, it's endangered in Massachusetts, it's common where you are, is Quercus muhlenbergii, yellow chestnut oak. It has an acorn that is really favored by animals. It's supposed to be one of the sweetest. It's called chinkapin or yellow chestnut oak. There's a few trees you can confuse it with. It should be used more as an ornamental. It thrives on limestones. When I'm in southern Michigan and I get home and I'm driving down these farm roads, there's still these massive trees along the road and in farm fields that the farmers have preserved. I recommend this tree as a tree for your garden. We have, and as you do as well, a dwarf version of chinkapin. It's called Quercus prenoides. It's all over. It's in my garden here on Martha's Vineyard. It's one of the few, there's a group of about a dozen in North America, rhizotomous oaks, oaks that spread from underground stems. You saw Quercus stellata that was induced by cutting it, but prenoides is one that will form a colony. And it has really, really attractive acorns, especially to turkeys and other birds that love them. It's an early successional plant on Martha's Vineyard and throughout New England. It's generally more or less on the field edges or beneath a canopy of other oaks. So a very valuable small growing oak if you don't have room for a large one. This is a tree that you'll see that looks a little bit like muhlenbergii, but the bark is the tell-all. It's got kind of this platy bark that's very distinct. It used to be called Quercus prinus, which is very close to prenoides. It's called Quercus montana. It's been changed, the name, of course, to confuse us. It's called the chestnut oak. Again, it's in that same group of prenoides, muhlenbergii, and a few others. Great, beautiful acorns, attractive foliage, very much like muhlenbergii, but the bark is quite different. I wanted to mention that oaks, in terms of their value for food, not just for wildlife, but for humans throughout time, ancient cultures have depended on oaks. There's a book that describes this, that an archaeologist had described it as a Bolano culture, which means surviving on acorns. We kind of are in a grain culture or granoculture now with rice and cereals. But early on, the original indigenous tribes of Middle East, China, Mexico, and California, because oaks are all over, depended on them as their staple food. So eating acorns is a thing and was a thing, and it goes back 8,000 years or more. When I was in California, I saw these amazing kind of holes in the ground underneath oaks, and they've chronicled the use of the local tribes of making a porridge or an oatmeal or even a bread out of acorn meal. And they put them in these baskets, and these baskets are still in museums. They're acorn baskets. They had these baskets that they'd make above ground to put the acorns in. They're called granaries, and then the rain would wash out those tannins and make them edible. So you can, in fact, eat acorns, and I have. Did they taste good? I recommend putting maple syrup on their acorn pancakes. and a little bit of brown sugar in the oatmeal or the oak meal. So there is classes that you can take, and we've had one by Arthur Haynes, From Tree to Table, on how to make your own porridge. There is this group there in your handout, the Acorn, New England Acorn Cooperative, that go on to talk about how you can have a harvest or a harvest festival. And it goes into great detail about how to make acorn meals and lots of recipes. We're going to just talk about the Black Oak group briefly because I don't have much time, but I did want to mention they're a little bit harder to look at and distinguish between than the White Oak group. The Black Oak group, which is out throughout Michigan, when I was there, I used to collect it, has this very furrowed bark, hairy buds, these early acorns right here, the inner cupule, which I mentioned, which is very hairy, not glabrous. And then the cup scales, I should mention this if I forgot, they overlap and they kind of lift off, where the White Oak group there adhered to very tight and you can't pick away with them. So Black Oak is a tree that's native to Martha's Vineyard. In the Midwest, you find it in sand dunes and sandy areas. Here's a giant tree about 175 years old on our campus here, this old fireplace. It did suffer some damage from the wind, and it actually split wide open. We had it cabled, so this is preservation at Poly Hill of an old oak. It had a walkway, and you may or may not know this, you see it on campuses all the time. Foot traffic is a real bummer for trees. It compacts the roots. The roots are generally in the top 10 to 14 inches of the soil. So we did this whole renovation of the soil with organic matter. We cabled the tree. And I'm happy to say this used to be a hole, this crack that you could see daylight through. So it has healed. It cost us about $15,000 to do this, but it was well worth it. A note that you know mostly from woodland conditions is red oak. It's a very elegant acorn that it has. And here are the terminal buds, a little bit hairy like most of the red oak or black oak group. The bark is very distinctive. As you look up, you can see what I call kind of these divisions in the bark that look like ski slopes. It's a real interesting identification feature, and here it is at the Morton Arboretum. A big, big tree. Good fall color on red oak. Scarlet oak should be used more often. It's a mid-sized tree. It's not as tall as a red oak. It has a more cut leaf and kind of more shiny leaf, hairy terminal buds. This appears sometimes, but not always, at the base, the styler end, I should say. The top of the acorn is this kind of concentric ring, which you can see. It's not always present. Beautiful fall color. About, I don't know, 1% of our oak population on Martha's Vineyard is scarlet oak. Pin oak is a tree that grows in wetlands, and I mentioned that trees that grow in wetlands make good urban trees, probably overplanted. We do know that it has problems in high alkalinity sites. It prefers acid soils. When it's in high alkalinity, it gets kind of this chlorosis, iron chlorosis. Its claim to fame, though, in the silhouette is the last bottom third, the branches hang down, the middle are kind of horizontal, and then the top go upright. So it has a distinct habit that landscape architects love. It is a beautiful tree and highly adaptable to urban conditions. I wanted to bring up this tree because we're talking about forests and the importance of trees in nature and why we plant oaks and love oaks. This is a native oak which nobody would plant in general because it's called scrub oak. It's the Rodney Dangerfield of oaks. It's a rhizotomous oak that grows on Martha's Vineyard in the red oak group, and it grows in these frost bottoms. This is June 11th, about 10 years ago, where these old frost bottoms that come up from the Atlantic Ocean of dense fog can come in and roll in with cold frost, and it wipes out the leaves and they leaf out again. But there was a bird on Martha's Vineyard that went extinct. It's called the Heath Hen, and it used to live in this area in shelter and eat the oak acorns. Through kind of isolation and time, it ended up getting down in its numbers, and they established the first nature preserve on Martha's Vineyard in 1903 to save the Heath Hen. The very last Heath Hen, believe it or not, got hit by a car, and now it's extinct. But that's kind of my go-to message as we're looking at the future of life on the planet. The Heath Hen has a memorial here. There's a story about it. If you are teachers, you should show this to kids in school. The Lost Bird Project talks about the Heath Hen. The last known spot right here is this ceramic sculpture. But it's a story of the connectivity of 12 different birds over time, the passenger pigeon, the auk, that have gone extinct, and it tells why, and it's habitat destruction, as you might imagine. I wanted to go into the central crux of it, though, is Oak Flora Supports Fauna. This is a wonderful book. It's mostly involves California oaks, and it talks about 800 species of oaks on 17 different orders of insects, I should say, that are codependent on oak species, as many as 5,000 associated with California oaks. And this is Doug Tallamy's message. There's so much life associated with oaks. And so the book goes into great detail about this. This is the book that started it all. Many of you know this, and your first talk was about this. And so this is what we're getting at. Oaks provide leaf forage for 517 species of native moths and butterflies. There is a wonderful thing on the Wild Ones website, a wonderful depiction of what different groups of trees support the most caterpillars. Oaks are the most valued. The Nature of Oaks, this book came out last year and I loved it. I did a review for the American Gardener of it. This actual quote in it, it's not all obvious. There's far more life under oak trees than on them. So in the book, he talks about, yeah, we do recognize that lacebugs, cicadas, plant hoppers, all these things depend on oaks for their life cycle. But it turns out beneath oaks, because of their heavy leaves and the mulch that they supply, are springtails, microorganisms, fungi, bacteria that count in the millions. And so while we cherish oaks as an upright, beautiful shade tree, it's really the entirety of what's going on immediately below ground with oaks that make oaks so special. So he says that these insects and all these other things count in the millions. This is a book I recommend to get a closer association with insects that feed on oaks. It's in your handout. This is one in my yard that I love on post oak. It's kind of cool how it eats it. Most people should know that oaks will have these things and they won't kill the tree. They're closely associated with them. They produce these wonderful galls. The galls are insects that use the leaf as their life cycle. It is the source of ink. As you can see here, oak galls and ink making. So the first ink in medieval times is made from oak galls in Europe and also in North America. They're still making ink out of galls in Mexico. But oaks in a changing world, they are the canary in the coal mine. I do have to tell you that they are in trouble in parts of the United States. 31% of the species of oaks around the world are in threat of extinction. I'm working on US oaks. US oaks, we have 3% that are critically endangered, 10% that are endangered, and that's some of our work here. This happened at Polly Hill. It was tough to see. This is oak mortality from an insect explosion in 2008. And there you can see it. That's our property. The oaks have recovered, I can tell you, which is good, but it was devastating to see. It was caused by a native insect that exploded, somehow due to climate change, where whatever its parasitoids and other things kept it in check. Because of a warming climate and warming winters, they exploded and caused these outbreaks. So this is something we're concerned about. Here's our main campus. Here's our woodlot, thousands of trees. Here I am. I can tell you these have all fallen down. We didn't take these out of our woodlands. They're important part of the carbon. They're important for birds and other mammals. So these oaks are now being replaced by young oaks. Oak wilt is a problem to look out for on red oak, particularly in the red oak group. It does attack the white oak group, but not to the same extent. It is in Ohio. You probably are aware of it. It just is starting to appear in Massachusetts. I want to switch over just briefly as I finish on a more positive note about oaks in the nursery production. They have challenges mostly from fleshy taproots. The oaks I mentioned, pin oak and bicolor, are used for grafting because they have slightly modified root systems. Acorn production is another way that they produce them, with container production with continuous root pruning. And oak cloning, you can root oaks. We use these root maker pots. Here's an acorn sprouting. These pots essentially, over time, they cause dieback or air pruning of the roots, so they produce more fibrous root systems. You see these holes. So that's what happens. They just dry out and they resprout, and instead of putting down a massive taproot, form a fibrous taproot. We put them in cages because they will be eaten. They'll be eaten even like a year and a half later. So we keep them in these cages. We've modified the cages. Chipmunks and squirrels are the main things that eat them. The cages we've made taller now. You build them with a bottom and a top, and so the oaks can grow up. When they get about their second year, 2.5 years old, we plant them out. We have had success with some endangered oaks with micropropagation of tissue culture. I did want to mention you can't save oaks with seed saving. You can't put them into cold storage. They have such a fleshy oak acorn that it won't last. You have to sow them immediately, but they are excising embryos and growing them on augers, and also freezing the embryos and having some success for long-term storage of endangered oaks. Where do you see them? Well, you guys in Ohio are pretty lucky. You can go to the Holden Forests and Gardens. You're part of what's called the Quercus multi-site group, which is the plant collections network. You have beautiful oaks at the Holden Forest. The Holden is a magical place. I adore it and love it. So you should be going there. There are 15 gardens that have extensive oak collections. The Holden is one of them. The other place to go is go out in your natural areas. Now that you have so much knowledge about these different oaks, go out and meet them where they live. I also would encourage you to become a member of the Oak Society. It's not that expensive. Their journal is the best journal you could ever imagine on oak ecology and diversity on a worldwide basis. I'm on their board, and I manage an oak conservation and research fund, which we use that fund to support saving oaks from extinction all over the world. We have a really interesting project in Vietnam, a tissue culture project, and then a project in Mexico teaching people how they can coexist with oaks and make charcoal from oak trees, which is how they sustain themselves. 2 books I'd recommend. You're already familiar with these, a lot of them, but the tree book is more recent. I also wrote this forward to the journal more recently. You know, it's been kind of, let's admit, the last 2.5 years, we've been kind of a little bit crazy. You know, one of the great things about planting oaks is we know from Doug Tallamy's message is you're planting an ecosystem when you plant an oak, but it is a reason for hope to plant oaks. And so I encourage you to do that. I wrote this article, Turn to Oaks in Time of Uncertainty, and I think you'll feel better the more oaks you see and the more oaks you preserve. And so I'm going to finish because I want to save time for questions. I just went a little bit over. I feel pretty good about that, but I've been talking very fast. But anyway, thank you again. I really appreciate this opportunity. And if you need to get a hold of me with questions, go to info@polyhillarboretum.org. It's on the sheet that Renee is going to share with you. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Tim. I put the sheet in the chat, but I will be emailing it to everyone following today's session also. And we do have a couple questions, but I'm melting over that Heath Hen.
Yeah, it's a cool story, isn't it? Sad
Poor
though.
thing.
Yeah.
Very, very sad.
Uh,
Thanks for letting us know about it, though. I'm going to look up the Lost Bird Project.
Yeah,
after the
it's very
session.
cool. I think you can get it online, and I think it's free somewhere. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's a question, Tim. Someone bought a swamp white oak last year, and the grower said it was grafted. Is this normal?
That isn't normal. It should be fine on its own roots. Yeah. The only reason it might be grafted, typically bicolor would be what it would be grafted on, a scion of a certain selection. If it was like an upright selection, white oak can be grafted onto bicolor and several others, but that is unusual. It should survive on its own roots.
Okay. Which oaks lose their leaves soonest?
Well, I would say the black oak group does. That whole group loses it, and the black oak group overall has better fall color. In terms of early frost, I note that the black oak group, they all seem to get hit harder by early frost, or just even normal frost. One thing that I think all of you guys know is oaks tend to hold on to their winter foliage, and white oak will do that. So white oak on Martha's Vineyard still has, in the central portion of the tree, leaves hanging onto it. And it's very curious. They won't drop until the new buds spring out. So white oak holds its leaves into the winter. It's something Doug Tallamy goes into his book about. It's very curious.
Okay. How vital is it to inoculate the trees with mycorrhiza when you plant them?
I have never done that, but I will say, if you are harvesting an oak off of a tree, an acorn off of a tree, I would go ahead, if you're putting it into your own garden, and dig a little of the soil up underneath it, just a handful, not that much, on the duff of the oak tree, and then bring that back into your garden and plant that acorn using that soil. And that soil may get the tree through, but generally we don't do it. But I have heard that people who live in areas where all the soil's been removed, which is too bad, but new home sites, very possible that you had soil trucked in. If you want to do that, you can get local soil that will help. That would be the better thing.
Okay. Now here's the situation. If a rabbit bit off the terminal bud of my 15-inch tall Quercus bicolor, will it grow a new terminal bud or die?
It should sprout from down below. Yes, you're going to be okay.
Okay, now I didn't get a chance to read this one, so let me see. Do the oaks that take 2 years of acorns to mature have a 1-year-old crop and a 2-year-old crop at the same time, therefore giving acorns every year?
Yeah, you'll see a small immature acorn on the second, towards the base of the tree as you move down the stem, but that acorn is not viable. It still needs another year to fill out. The acorn on the end, the second year, not on the end, but almost the end is the ripe one. So you still have to wait 18 months, essentially.
Okay. And here is the last one. I have 2 4 to 5-year-old oaks planted by squirrels, one white and one red.
Wow.
They're going to be demolished due to a city regrading project. Can they be transplanted?
Yes, and I don't know what your timing is or your availability, but do it right now.
Okay.
I would do it if you could. I would do it in the end of March in the dormant season and move them. I've had tremendous success doing that with smaller trees. Once they leaf out, it's very, very difficult. So, harvest them, try to get as much as the root system as you can, and do it well before they leaf out. I've been very successful moving American beech this way, which is a relative of oaks. It's in the same plant family, and they're best moved when they're dormant.
Okay. Excellent. We did get another question pop up here, though. In your experience, do most communities encourage planting oaks along street and sidewalks, or is there a lot of concern over acorns causing problems for pedestrians and cars?
Yes, there is a bias against oaks, but you know what? Go ahead and plant them anyway. I think, we complain about some of the things and you're really like, wow, really? I mean, so I really think there's enough ecological mojo behind growing an oak that you shouldn't let that stop you. I'm involved with a new street tree project here, and we're actually going to grow some white oaks for,
Nice.
from seed. It'll take 3 to 4 years to get them up to size, but yeah, you should plant them anyways.
And I live in an older neighborhood in Cleveland, and we have some beautiful swamp white oaks that grow on the tree lawns, and they're just gorgeous, and no matter what tree you plant, it seems like someone's going to complain about something.
That's true. Yes. Yeah, you're right. I mean, if it's a beautiful
something falls.
Well, if it's a beautiful flowering tree, they'll hate the bees. Like, come on.
You can't win, Tim. You can't win. Okay, wait, one last question came in. Should I take out grass underneath a large red oak?
Yeah, what you can do is just kind of go to like 3/4 out around the crown, and you can just cover the grass with mulch, some type of mulch, and make sure it's aged composted mulch. And that way that'll help your tree. Grass and human foot traffic are the two things that oaks don't like. So if you can eliminate grass, I mean, a lot of people love grass and that's their thing, but it is in direct competition with the roots. So if you can mulch your tree, you don't have to go to the extent of what we call the drip line, but get a decent ring of mulch. It will definitely help your tree.
Okay, sounds good. Well, Tim, then if any more questions come in, I'll probably just end up emailing them to you and we can cover them later.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tim.
All right,
Okay,
take care.
Yep, I'm gonna look for David Burke here. And thank you for that lovely plug for our Holden Arboretum here in Cleveland, Ohio. It was very kind of you. Hey, David.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me all right?
Good. Yeah, we have a couple of minutes, so I'm just gonna wait until 2 o'clock to get started, just in case people are jumping on and off today. But yeah, thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, great. It's 2:00. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Burke. He's the Vice President of Science and Conservation at Holden Forests and Gardens. He's going to be presenting today on forest health research, protecting the forest ecosystem. Welcome, David.
Thanks. Great to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. There we go. Let's give that a try. All right. Hopefully you can see that.
Looks good.
Great. All right. Fantastic. So it's great to be here and to take some time to talk with all of you about some of the research that we're doing here at Holden Forests and Gardens. So great segue from the last talk into this one. So I am at Holden Forests and Gardens and based here at the Holden Arboretum. For many of you who don't know Holden Forests and Gardens includes both the Holden Arboretum and the Cleveland Botanical Garden as well. And so this is one organization, but my work takes place primarily at the Holden Arboretum. And that photograph you're seeing there on your left is from one of our plantations here at Holden. So I'm going to talk today about some of the work that we're doing really in this area of plant and forest health protection. So the photo that you're seeing there on the left is one of our plantations here. That's a research plantation, and it is a plantation of beech trees. So we're going to talk quite a bit about beech. It's an important component of many of our forests. We're going to talk about beech, and all those trees you see there on that photograph are actually resistant to a disease called beech bark disease. And those trees were developed as part of a project with the U.S. Forest Service that goes back a couple of decades now. And so all of those trees were selected and developed for resistance to beech bark disease by the U.S. Forest Service. And we were a partner on that work. But in addition to beech bark disease, our beech trees unfortunately are now affected by another disease, which you see there on the right there in that photograph, called beech leaf disease. And we're going to talk a little bit about beech leaf disease. So our beeches are getting hammered, both from beech bark disease as well as beech leaf disease. But we're doing a lot of research to try to keep these plants within our landscape. So we're going to talk about beech. We're going to also talk about hemlock as well. And just to give you a general overview of Holden and the research program here, this is a picture of the Long Science Center at the Holden Arboretum. This is where I'm based and where I'm coming to you from today. We have labs here and greenhouse and nursery facilities, as you can see, and a good portion of our work really relates to forest health protection. Research began at Holden in about 1991, and it was focused originally on plant breeding, but the plant breeding was geared towards ornamental plant breeding, especially things like rhododendron. And so we still have a very large rhododendron research and conservation program, including a campus in about 30 minutes from here in Madison, Ohio, called the David G. Leach Research Center. And that is a 30-acre campus devoted to rhododendron. So quite beautiful. If you ever have the opportunity to go out there, sometimes we give public tours. I strongly encourage you to do so. It's a beautiful place in the spring. So research here, really plant breeding, began focusing on those ornamental plants. In about 2000, Holden began working with the U.S. Forest Service. And that work originally focused on beech bark disease. So the work with the Forest Service was on beech bark disease. I showed a little bit of a picture of that plantation a moment or two ago. And we continue to work with the U.S. Forest Service on beech bark disease, excuse me. But in addition to beech bark disease, we're also working on 4 other diseases across 3 different plant species, ash, hemlock, and beech. And we'll talk about all of those today. More recently, we've been a partner in what's called the Great Lakes Basin Forest Health Collaborative. And this is a project that's funded with money from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative by way of the U.S. Forest Service, and focusing on those 3 tree species, ash, beech, and hemlock, and trying to develop resistance and breeding programs and partnerships throughout the Great Lakes region. And I'll talk a little bit about that sort of towards the end of the talk today. So as I mentioned, these are the 4 really pests and diseases that we're working on. 3 tree species. Up there in the upper left is emerald ash borer. So that's the adult insect. Emerald ash borer is a problem really first noted in the Detroit area in Michigan and kind of spreading throughout that region, really having a significant impact on the loss of ash within many of our forests. And the borer basically girdles the tree, lives underneath the bark and girdles the tree, eventually resulting in its death. So that is a focus of our research here, but we're not going to go into ash too much today. We're going to talk mostly about hemlock and beech. Hemlock is there on the lower left. And so hemlock is affected by an insect called hemlock woolly adelgid. You can see that insect right here. It forms this cottony sort of mass. Underneath there's a little insect. It's a scale-like insect similar to an aphid. It has sucking mouth parts that penetrate the leaf and will begin to take its nutrition from the leaf. And in so doing, it weakens the tree, and this can lead to tree death over time. So we're working with hemlock woolly adelgid, and that's kind of really a newer research program for us. We haven't done a lot of work with hemlock in the past. The tree that we've done a lot of work with is beech, and this is what you see here on the right. This is beech. This is the organism really responsible for beech bark disease. It is a scale-like insect again that lives on the bark and will penetrate the bark with its mouth parts and feed. And it actually creates wounds that a fungus, which we'll talk about, can then invade and then damage the tree. And so that's one of the agents of beech bark disease. And the other organism we're dealing with is this little microscopic animal here called a nematode. Looks a little like a worm. And this is Littleanchus crinatus, which, as we've discovered, is the cause of beech leaf disease, which is the newest disease affecting beech, and one that we've been probably most active in trying to both identify the cause and trying to find some solutions and understand this complex most over the last several years. So we're going to talk really about hemlock, and we're going to talk about beech. We're first going to talk about beech. So a little bit about beech trees and the biography of beech and its ecological role before we go into the problems associated, or the problems that are affecting beech and some of our work on them. Beech are beautiful trees, and so they have beautiful fall foliage, great green leaves during the summertime, and of course, beautiful bark. And so that really smooth, silvery bark is a hallmark of beech trees. And people like to carve their initials into the bark. I don't recommend doing that personally, but certainly the bark is quite beautiful, and one of the reasons why this tree is quite so attractive. There are 7 species of beech worldwide, so not a lot of species of beech, not like oaks, as we just heard in the previous talk. 7 species, but Fagus grandifolia is our American beech. That is the only genus of beech in North America. So Fagus grandifolia, American beech, is the only species of beech in North America. There are a couple of other species of interest. Fagus sylvatica is European beech. And so that is often used as a landscape specimen in a lot of places. And so you might have Fagus sylvatica or encountered Fagus sylvatica in gardens and in landscapes. Other species of beech of interest, Fagus crinatus, which we'll talk about a little bit. That's Japanese beech, and the reason for that is its relationship to beech leaf disease. And Fagus orientalis, which is oriental beech, found in really southern Europe and into Asia, Asia Minor, into that area there. It's an important species. But Fagus grandifolia is our native beech, and that's the beech that we have in North America. In addition to being beautiful, they're large, so they can grow up as much as 80 feet tall. They're a component of many of our mature forests, and they can be used for furniture. So from a commercial standpoint, beech are sometimes used for furniture, for flooring, but I will tell you that they're not really a preferred tree from a forestry perspective. Foresters tend to prefer things like oak, maple, for example, and so beech is not really viewed as a really desirable species from the point of view of forestry. So from a commercial standpoint, beech isn't all that really, but it is quite beautiful from an aesthetic standpoint. It has other important ecological roles. Beech is a long-lived tree. So what you're looking at there is what I'm calling a tree cookie. So this is a tree that fell over and died in Stebbins Gulch, which is one of our natural areas here. It's a mature forest. We weren't sure how old some of these trees were, but we did take this cookie, a cross-section of the tree, and thanks to the folks at the College of Worcester Tree Ring Lab, they were able to age this tree for us. And this tree is estimated to have begun growing back in 1756. So some of these forests here at Holden and other places in Ohio are actually quite old, and beech trees can become quite old. 250 years, they can live to about that. though some have been estimated to live to as much as 366 years in places like Pennsylvania. Beech is shade tolerant. It grows in mature forests. It can very slowly grow in the understory and then eventually reach the canopy and as it becomes an adult. They do produce lots of suckers, so root sprouts. If you go into a forest and you see beech, you'll see lots of root sprouts. They also tend to hold their leaves. So very often they will hold their leaves late into winter. Even now, as we go through some of our natural areas, some of these beech are still holding their leaves, at least in the understory. So that's a characteristic of these beech. And of course, important components of the beech maple forest that we have here in Northern Ohio. Now, one of the interesting things about beech is the genus is Fagus. So Fagus grandifolia is our American beech. Fagus comes from, is the Latin word, but it comes from a Greek word, phagos, meaning eating. And so it really kind of highlights the importance of this tree as a resource. The nuts are very edible. The tree is edible, and they begin to produce nuts when they're about 40 years old. And it is one of our most important nut-bearing trees. Sometimes nuts are referred to as hard-mast, and it is important for wildlife. So even though foresters may not like beech very much, they may not be the most desirable tree for commercial lumber production or furniture production. For wildlife, it is incredibly important. All kinds of critters eat this tree or the nuts from this tree. Mice and squirrels, chipmunks, black bear, deer, grouse, foxes, and many, many more. So beech nuts are incredibly important, and they're an incredibly important food resource. Douglas Talmy in his book, Bringing Nature Home, has indicated that beech can support or provide food for caterpillars of over 100 different species of butterflies and moths. And so also really important for our butterflies and our moths and many of our pollinators. So beech might not be the most important tree commercially, but if we're thinking about its ecological role, we really need to think about things like turkeys and wildlife and deer and all of these organisms that really depend upon beech for their sustenance. Beech also, because it creates really interesting conditions within our forest, lots of shade, is really important for maintaining a lot of forest wildflowers too, that really can grow into those more shady conditions that we see in some of these beech forests. So beech is a really important tree ecologically, especially if we think about wildlife and pollinators. Beech has a very wide distribution going from Nova Scotia all the way down to the Gulf Coast in the eastern US, some disjunct populations there in Texas, but for the most part, it is east of the Mississippi. We have extensive beech forests in Ohio and up into Wisconsin and throughout some of the Great Lakes region. But beech is threatened by three different things. First being beech bark disease, and we'll talk about that next. Climate change is also a problem for beech. With climate change, we expect precipitation patterns to really change. We may see drier years or wetter years, and that fluctuation in precipitation might not be the best for beech. Beech may not really like those large fluctuations in precipitation that may be accompanied by climate change. So climate change is a concern when it comes to the distribution of beech. And the other problem that we're dealing with more recently is beech leaf disease. And so we'll talk a little bit about beech leaf disease as well, what this is, obviously caused by this little nematode that I mentioned, and some of the work that we're doing to try to find some potential solutions for beech leaf disease. Now, as I mentioned, beech bark disease is one of the threats to beech. This is a disease that's really caused by two different organisms. The first is that scale-like insect, the Cryptococcus there, that I showed a little bit earlier, which will live on the bark and will feed from the tree by penetrating the bark. It causes wounding of the bark, and that wounding allows for the entrance of a fungus called neonectria. And you can see that neonectria in this photograph here. That's causing that red coloration. And what this neonectria does is it feeds on the tree, and it eventually will girdle the tree, leading to its death. That's a little bit more of a close-up picture of what the neonectria looks like. And so this is caused by these two different organisms. It's been in North America a really long time. It was introduced from Europe by way of Nova Scotia in the 1890s. And since then, it's spread throughout much of the eastern US. Mortality is really high. About 50% of trees will die after the initial wave of disease that comes through. But studies have shown that about 5% of beech trees in natural populations will be resistant. So that's kind of a good thing. That's a hopeful thing. And that's also the basis for much of the work that's being done to try to select for and develop resistance to beech bark disease. And resistance to beech bark disease has been carried out extensively by Jennifer Cook, who's with the U.S. Forest Service. And the photos here are from one of Jennifer's papers with David Carey, who works with her. And what you're seeing here is really how selection for disease takes place. And what they focused on is they focused on resistance of the bark to the scale-like insect. So this is the scale-like insect growing on the bark here. And what's done is the scale-like insect, this insect here, is placed on a tree, and then the tree is wrapped with this foam material. You put a little cone over that to keep it sort of dry. And then you allow the insect to do its thing. If the bark can be penetrated by the mouth parts of the insect, then the insect will feed and survive and reproduce. And eventually you get lots and lots of insects living on that bark. And so as you remove this foam wrapping, you'll see something that looks like this. That tells you that that tree is not resistant to this insect. This insect is going to penetrate the bark. It's going to feed and reproduce, and it's going to create wounding that fungus can then exploit. And that's not what we want, right? So this tree that you see here is not resistant to beech bark disease. Now, if you take the foam off and you see something like this, well, this is good news, because what this is telling us is that that insect here was not able to survive and reproduce and grow. It was not able to wound or damage this bark, and therefore there's no way for that fungus that would girdle it, that neonectaria, to get in there and cause a problem for our tree. And so this is what we really want to see. This is a tree that is potentially resistant to beech bark disease. And of course, the photograph in the middle shows us something in sort of intermediate between a tree that may be resistant and a tree that may be susceptible to beech bark disease. So this sort of selection work has been done really since about 2000, mostly by Jennifer Cook and her colleagues. A lot of that work taking place here at Holden. And about 480 trees were eventually found through the screening process to be potentially resistant to beech bark disease. And they were planted out at the Arboretum in this research plot here, which is at our Lower Baldwin site. And so the 480 trees were planted there and allowed to grow under field conditions. Most of the work for screening takes place within our greenhouses. And so it's done within greenhouse conditions with trees in pots. And then once they're found to be potentially resistant, they can be moved out into the field, and then they can be grown under field conditions. And then we want to test them and trial them under field conditions, because that's the conditions that these trees are going to need to survive in nature, right? Not pampered in our greenhouses where they're getting adequate water and adequate light. They're going to need to survive out in the field. So those trees were planted out at Lower Baldwin. And then after a period of time, that testing was done again, where they introduced the scale-like insect to some of these branches and then waited to see what the result was. And it turned out that about 80 of those trees, even under field conditions, were found to be resistant to beech bark disease. So those trees were retained. Anything that was found to be potentially susceptible, removed. And this plantation now, some of these trees are about 15 years or so old, and provides us with really the basis for a seed orchard, where as these trees grow and eventually produce seed, the seed can then be screened and evaluated for potential resistance as well. But all of these trees out here are resistant to beech bark disease and can be used then for really conservation and restoration programs, where if beech has really been eliminated from some of forests and landscapes, some of these trees could be potentially used, or cuttings or offshoots from these trees could be used as potential material to restore beech to those forests. Now, the problem here is that those trees at Lower Baldwin, although they're resistant to beech bark disease, are not in all cases resistant to beech leaf disease. And so beech leaf disease is a new complex that's affecting our beech trees. This was first discovered in Lake County, Ohio, by the Lake County Metro Parks in 2012. And so what you're seeing here is sort of characteristic beech leaf disease early symptoms, where you get this dark banding between the veins, right? So you can see what the color should be, but then you get this dark banding. Well, that in and of itself doesn't look too bad, right? Yeah, it's a little bit maybe unsightly, a little bit unusual, but it doesn't really look too bad in and of itself. But over time, the situation, the condition worsens. And hopefully you can see it here. These leaves start to become shrunken, they become leathery, and it really starts to begin to affect not only the appearance of the tree, but its ability to grow and survive. This disease showed up at the Arboretum in about 2014 with many of the symptoms that you see here. And since then, we've been monitoring it in some of our natural areas. This is again what some of these leaves look like when it's more advanced. You can see they get kind of leathery. And then as the symptoms progress and it becomes more severe, as the leaves open up in the spring, they will look like this. They'll be shrunken and malformed and damaged. So the damage is actually taking place in the buds. And that's interesting. And why that might be, I have an answer for you. But you see as the leaves, as the bud opens and the leaf develops, you already see the signs first thing in spring. And this results in really thinning of the canopy. This is the understory, and you can see a lot of light getting in here, and also the thinning of the canopy itself. And within 3 years, we've seen significant declines in canopy coverage from about 95% leaf canopy to 85% in just 3 years. This picture was taken a couple of years ago. Since then, many of these mature trees in our forests are beginning to die. And so some of these trees are hundreds of years old, and they are beginning to die as a result of beech leaf disease. So the question is, what is causing beech leaf disease? I kind of gave away the story in the beginning, but there was some discussion about what could be the cause. Is it a bacteria? Is it a fungus? What exactly is causing beech leaf disease? David McCain, who's with the Ohio Department of Agriculture, noticed in some leaves sent to him the presence of some nematodes, those little microscopic animals. And so the question arose as to whether the nematodes might actually be causing beech leaf disease. So in partnership with the Forest Service, we did a number of experiments. We looked at bacteria and fungi to see if there might be some bacteria and fungi on these leaves that would be a known pathogen that we could look at and say, okay, we find a known pathogen, known fungal pathogen that might be causing this. But we didn't really see anything that jumped out at us in terms of fungi, bacteria. Fungal communities are certainly different between leaves affected by beech leaf disease and not, but no real kind of smoking gun when it came to a fungal pathogen that could be causing this. So we did go down this path of looking at nematodes. Now these nematodes can be harvested, if you will, from the leaves and the buds. What we can do is we can collect the nematodes, we can collect leaves and buds, and basically we float them in water. So we soak them in water overnight, and these nematodes will swim out of the leaf or the bud, and then we can collect them. We can collect them and concentrate them. We can look at them underneath a microscope, count them, and then we can use them for some experiments. And what we can do is we can resuspend them in a little bit of liquid. And then what we can do is we can add them to the buds. And so what you see here is one of our experiments in the laboratory where we have a beech tree here. This is a healthy beech tree, doesn't have any beech leaf disease on it, big, nice, healthy buds. And what we did was we took a suspension of the nematodes, which you see right here in our little pipetter here, and a little syringe, plastic syringe, and we squirted them or injected them gently onto the surface of the bud, wrapping it with a little piece of tissue paper here. And then we wrap that with some wax paper for a couple of days just to keep things in there, keep it moist, keep the nematodes on the surface of the bud, give them an opportunity to get themselves in there and do their thing. And then we removed the tissue paper and the wax. And then we waited. You have to be patient with this. This was done in the fall. And so we waited through these trees after being inoculated in the lab, went back into our greenhouses. We waited till spring, and then we waited for the leaves to open up. What do we see? And do we see beech leaf disease? And the answer is yes, we do. So these leaves here, this shoot came off of a bud that we inoculated with nematodes. So if we inoculated the bud with nematodes, with live nematodes, we were able to see beech leaf disease. And so this new nematode, Littleanchus crenate, it's really not new. It was actually described first in Japan back in 2018 on Japanese beech. So it was found as a nematode on Japanese beech, causing something kind of different patterns, really kind of, it forms like yellow bands between the leaves, not this dark green that we see in spring here. But it was discovered first on Japanese beech by a group in Japan, not previously found in North America, but Lynn Carter with the USDA, who was one of our collaborators on this work, she led the team and identified and described this new, what really is a new subspecies of this nematode. It's called Little-Ancus Crinidae mccannii, which we think is the causative agent for beech leaf disease. Now, there could be some other things involved. There could be still bacteria and fungi involved with beech leaf disease, but basically the nematode is required for beech leaf disease. So I can add bacteria that we culture to buds, and I don't get beech leaf disease. The only time I will get beech leaf disease is if this nematode, that live nematode, is present. So the nematode is required for beech leaf disease, although it's still possible that there could be bacteria or fungi sort of involved with this pest. And so that's kind of the whodunit story of beech leaf disease, and we've been part of the team to try to understand and really identify the cause of beech leaf disease. This is some pictures from Lynn Carter's lab in USDA showing the nematode here. You can see the little critter. It's a little like a worm. This is the nematode inside buds and bud scales that were collected here at Holden. This is what a healthy leaf looks like using scanning electron microscopy. So really kind of zooming in. And what you can see here is sort of your textbook. Here's your surface of your leaf, your cuticle. And this is what's called the palisade layer, spongy mesophyll. And this is one of the veins. So you can see a very, very classic textbook anatomy of a leaf. And this is what a leaf looks like when it has the nematodes inside. So you can see how damaged this tissue is. So the nematodes are damaging the leaf and feeding on it. And the response of the leaf is, we think, to darken as it's being damaged. And so that we think that that dark venation that occurs is because the nematodes are actually feeding on the leaf, and for some reason the leaf is responding with darker pigmentation. Now, I told you we can look at these guys underneath a microscope, and we can count them and we can quantify them and work with them. I'm going to show you a little bit of a video of what these things look like up close and personal. So this is Little-Ancus Crinidae that we collected from some of our beech leaves and buds, and you can see it wiggling around there. It is a kind of a nasty little pest because it's causing a lot of damage to our beech trees. But having worked for a little while, I also think they're kind of cute. So kind of a love-hate sort of relationship here, because they are little animals that are just doing their thing, but causing a great deal of damage to our beech trees that really probably have not seen this pest in the past. So the work that we're doing, we continue to do work. We think we understand what causes beech leaf disease, or we know that this nematode is required for it. There could be some other bacterial or fungal components. And so we're continuing to do some work along those lines. We're also trying to develop some better detection methods. And in partnership with the Ohio Division of Natural Resources, we're conducting surveys across the state of Ohio. Beech leaf disease is most noted here in northeastern Ohio, but it is also present across really much of the northern US now. Pennsylvania, it's found in Connecticut, Long Island, Massachusetts, Southern Ontario in Canada. So it has begun to spread throughout much of our region, but not seen as much in Southern Ohio, although the surveying work that we did this fall identified some potential locations where we had a few samples that might contain the nematodes. So we need to follow up on those sites and go back at some point and see if we can actually see symptoms of beech leaf disease. We're also doing some pesticide work with Bartlett the tree. We're using some pesticides that might be able to control the nematode. So that could help control the nematode within the landscape. So if you have a beech tree in your yard, you might be able to use pesticide to control that nematode. Now, I will tell you that this nematode is not just affecting American beech, it also affects European beech, and it affects Oriental beech. And so those beech trees within our collection, because Holden has a large collection, we have all those species within our collections, they are all affected by beech leaf disease. They all will have beech leaf disease and affected by this nematode. The only species that we've seen that it seems to be resistant is Japanese beech. And that might be because Japanese beech evolved and has a previous experience with this nematode in Japan. So they may be somewhat resistant, but Japanese beech isn't really used as a landscape specimen. It is used by the bonsai trade. So Japanese beech is often used in bonsai, but not really used as a landscape specimen, although we do have a few of them here at Holden, and they look great. Whereas our American beech are largely not looking so hot these days. That said, we are searching for resistant trees. So just like with beech bark disease, we know that maybe 5% of the beech trees are resistant to beech bark disease. And so that could be the source of a breeding program, right? If we can identify those trees that are resistant to beech bark disease, we can then bring them into our greenhouses, we can screen them, we can test them, and they can then, if found to be resistant to beech bark disease, in fact, be used for the foundation of a breeding program with the potential to restore beech trees to areas to which they may have been largely eliminated by the disease. Same is true with beech leaf disease. And so we're looking through our forests and working with partners to try to identify trees that may be potentially resistant to beech leaf disease. And so these two pictures here, this is one of our beech trees at our Lower Baldwin site. This tree is resistant to beech bark disease, but you can see the beech leaf disease here on this tree fairly prominently. You can see it fairly prominently here with the banding and the thickening of these leaves. A short distance away is another tree within our plantation, also resistant to beech bark disease, but also looking pretty good in terms of its leaf. See a little bit, maybe a little bit of beech leaf disease down here. But most of these leaves look really great. So we're thinking that there may be some resistance, some natural resistance to beech leaf disease. So with working with partners, we've identified some trees here within Holden's natural areas that look really good. May also be resistant to beech leaf disease, working with the Cleveland Metro Parks as well, out at North Chagrin Reservation, with some folks from the Metro Parks collecting branches from beech trees that may be resistant to beech leaf disease. And what we can do is we can bring those back here to Holden and we can use them to graft them onto existing root stock. So we have roots, we have beech trees that are growing, good healthy root system. We can cut off the top of that beech tree growing here, and we can graft one of these potentially resistant branches onto that beech tree and do some additional testing. And so we're beginning that process of screening and identifying beech trees that may be resistant to beech leaf disease as part of the beginning of a breeding program where we can produce trees that are resistant to this new pest. So that's our story on beech. The work that we're doing hopefully will allow us to, at some point, reintroduce beech back into many places in which it's either been eliminated or dramatically reduced in terms of its abundance and frequency. The other tree that we're working on more recently, and this is kind of new, is Eastern hemlock, or sometimes called Canadian hemlock, Tsuga canadensis. Also a beautiful tree, beautiful landscape tree as well. It's a conifer, not a deciduous tree like beech, but it produces these small little cones at the tips of the branches. There are 4 species of hemlock in North America. So Canadian hemlock or Eastern hemlock being the one that we see here. There's also Carolina hemlock, Tsuga caroliniana, and also Tsuga heterophylla, which is Western hemlock. But Carolina hemlock is really restricted more to the southern US, southeast. We really don't see it here too much. We do have it within our collections, so it can grow in our climate. But as a native, it's restricted more to the southern US. Hemlock is also a really large tree, so it can become at least 100 feet tall. Largest known individual about 160 feet tall. These trees are really long-lived, so 400 years is not unusual. Some have been known to reach 550 years, and they can actually produce seeds up to 450 years in age. So each one of these little cones, and there could be lots of cones on a tree, on a mature tree, produce 12 to 15 small seeds. And so over the course of its lifetime, a hemlock can produce a lot of seed material. Hemlock are still present within our landscape. We see them in a lot of places, but they've also been really reduced in their occurrence. And that was because hemlock were largely harvested in the 19th century for their bark, and their bark was used in the tanning industry. And so whole forests, especially in places like the Adirondacks, were just cut down in order to harvest the bark for tanning. So really kind of restricted the range of hemlock, but we do still see them in a lot of places, especially along waterways and streams where they probably play their greatest ecological role. Hemlocks are very shade tolerant. They will germinate under very low light conditions. And they also will create deep shade. So if you've been in a hemlock forest, you know what I mean. It can be cool, it can be dark, and that's really important in many respects, ecologically. You have a whole suite of plants and other critters that really will live in those environments. And when it comes to streams, hemlocks are really important at keeping waters cool. So if we're thinking about cold water habitat, and we want to maintain the cold water habitat in many of our streams and the aquatic life that depends on cold water, hemlocks are important. And thinking about things like trout, for example, which really kind of need cold water because it's highly oxygenated. And so hemlocks really help keep the temperatures down in those streams, especially in the summertime when it can get kind of hot. So that helps maintain this cold water habitat that a lot of critters depend upon. Hemlock forests are used by as many as 90 different species of birds. And also moths and butterflies. There may be some species that are particular to hemlock forests. Some studies in the southern Appalachians found that there were some groups of Lepidoptera that were only found in hemlock stands in the southern US. So they may be important for certain groups of moths and butterflies as well. The range of hemlocks, in a way, is not very different from the range of American beech. So stretching really from Maine in this graphic all the way down into northern Georgia, and of course into Wisconsin and Michigan. The green area represents the range. What you see in red is the area where hemlock woolly adelgid is found. And so this is where hemlock woolly adelgid is found in 2010, but it has since spread from these locations. Hemlock woolly adelgid, southern US and East Coast, personal experience, I would tell you, heavily impacted this area of northwestern New Jersey and eastern PA. A lot of the hemlocks here were lost even 20 years ago from hemlock woolly adelgid. Doesn't like really cold conditions, hemlock woolly adelgid, but with climate change, it's starting to spread north. So our really cold winters can kind of suppress the presence of this insect, but as our winters warm and as the climate warms, this insect is beginning to move northward and affect hemlock stands in areas that we previously hadn't seen it. This is the scale-like insect here again on the leaves. So if you see these cottony masses, you have hemlock woolly adelgid. If you remove that cottony mass, this is what the little critter looks like. You can see his legs here. And like an aphid, he has mouth parts that will pierce the leaf and then will begin to extract its nutrition from it, right? It'll take sugars off of the leaf. That's great for the insect, not so good for the tree. And eventually it can lead to a loss of the trees itself, a dieback. And that's been especially the case in the southern US and along the East Coast. Hemlocks are beautiful when they're mature. This is one here in our Stebbins Gulch Natural Area. And we really would like to keep these trees on our landscape. And hemlock woolly adelgid is starting to become an issue in Ohio, in northern Ohio. The Nature Conservancy has led a monitoring program in northern Ohio that we've been one of the many partners in. And all of these locations are locations where the Nature Conservancy has looked for hemlock woolly adelgid. Holden Arboretum is here. I think this is North Chagrin Reservation. For those of you in Cleveland, you know where that is. And so hemlock woolly adelgid is present within our area and making its presence known. Another insect that we're finding is something called hemlock elongate scale. And that is actually a pest that was introduced from Europe about 100 years ago. It is known to feed and affect hemlock, not considered really a significant pest in the sense that there's no real association with it causing major hemlock dieback, whereas hemlock woolly adelgid, it is associated with dieback, but another pest of hemlock within our region. And worried, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, beech are affected by beech bark disease. Now you've got beech leaf disease. You got kind of a 1-2 punch going there. You kind of worry about hemlock woolly adelgid and the presence of elongate scale and whether you get a 1-2 punch there, where they really in combination begin to more severely affect these trees than either insect would on its own. That would be a topic for additional research. Right now, our work with hemlock is focused through some of our work with the Forest Health Collaborative. This here is a map from the National Seed Lab. Each pin represents a location in which hemlock seeds have been collected and then sent to the National Seed Lab. And what you'll notice here is that there's really no collection in Northern Ohio or Michigan or in this area of the Great Lakes, kind of a big hole. So we're right now working with partners to collect seed from populations within this region. And the reason being that you never know when you might find a population that could be potentially resistant to hemlock woolly adelgid. So the idea is to collect the seed and then bring it into our greenhouses and potentially evaluate for potential for resistance to this insect. Another thing we're doing is testing pesticide effects. You can see that here, hemlock woolly adelgid can be controlled with pesticides. That's a good thing. But some of these pesticides can have other effects. So some concern about how the pesticide may affect other critters, other insects that may be feeding on natives that may be feeding on hemlock naturally, and also whether those pesticides could actually make the trees more susceptible to other pests and diseases. So that's one of the research projects that we're pursuing right now, is how do some of these commonly used pesticides that are used to control hemlock woolly adelgid overall affect the physiology of these plants, of these trees. And as I mentioned, we're collecting seed. This is Rachel Kapler. Rachel's our forest health coordinator. And so she's been leading some of this effort with the Great Lakes Basin Forest Health Collaborative and beginning to collect seeds throughout the region. You can see her with a pole pruner there, collecting some seed from our little mountain natural area. This is what the little cones look like in the fall. When they turn purple like this, they're ripe. And you can collect the seed and harvest them. And those seeds should be viable at that time. So working with partners to bring a lot of seed into the Arboretum at this point for potential storage and germination and testing. So a little bit more about the Forest Health Collaborative on the few minutes I have here. This is kind of a map of the service area for the Forest Health Collaborative. So the Great Lakes states, everything you see there in green. This is sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service, a number of partners, including American Forests and the Holden Arboretum. Rachel Kapler is our Forest Health Coordinator, based here at the Arboretum. And this collaborative was set up to support tree breeding activities associated with species of concern. And right now, those species of concern are ash, beech, and hemlock. So the goal is to create a network of partners throughout this region that can be involved with sort of identifying trees that may be resistant. We're doing a lot of that with not only with hemlock, with ash right now. So looking for lingering ash in areas where emerald ash borer has gone through, but some of these trees still survive. So that's an indication that the tree may be resistant to emerald ash borer. So looking for lingering ash as part of these breeding and selection programs. So, but also beginning to look for beech as well, as I mentioned. And then the goal is to do screening and breeding and testing for resistance with the ultimate objective of having material that can be reused for restoration purposes. We're thinking about beech and hemlock, we're thinking about natural areas and forests, often not street trees. But when we're thinking about ash, we're thinking not only about our forests, but about street trees as well, because we know that ash is a really important, or has been a very important street tree in many of our communities. Ash was what was planted to take the place of American elm. So when American elm was affected by Dutch elm disease, communities lost elm in large numbers. And one of the solutions was to plant ash. So now, of course, we have emerald ash borer affecting those communities. So the work that we're doing here should benefit our natural areas and our forests through potential restoration of these trees, and introduction of resistant individuals, but also could potentially affect or benefit our urban environments with the ash program that is a part of the Forest Health Collaborative. So with that, I think I'm right about at time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to acknowledge a number of individuals here. Rachel Kapler, as I mentioned, is our Forest Health Coordinator, an expert on ash. So if anybody wants to know about ash, Rachel's the person to reach out to. Jennifer Cook, who's with the Forest Service and other collaborators with the U.S. Forest Service, and they have provided a fair amount of support and funding for us here, not only through the Forest Health Collaborative, but also for some of our research. And then a whole bunch of people in my lab, especially Mary Pitts, who contributed some of those photographs and some of those maps, who's been doing a lot of the beech leaf disease research here. And with that, I can take any questions that you might have.
Great, thanks, David. Wonderful presentation. So you're going to answer a lot of people's questions if you tell us how the nematode moves from tree to tree.
Okay, I can do that. So, so we believe that what the nematode is doing is it's from tree to tree is a little bit hard. We know that what it does is it probably exits the leaves in fall, and then it will enter the buds. So the nematode the nematode requires water, requires a water film. And so what it will effectively do is swim out of the leaf. And then on that water film, it can then enter a bud. So if you have, we think a season that's particularly damp and wet, you might get more movement of those nematodes. And that's one of the reasons why we're collecting some of these trees from our forests that may be resistant to beech leaf disease, because we're not entirely sure if the tree is resistant, or maybe it's just in a really sunny spot. And so you don't get a lot of moisture on those leaves, so the nematode can't move around too much. So it probably swims from the leaf to the bud, colonizes the bud, and then they overwinter in the bud. They feed and damage the bud over winter, and that's why when those buds open up in the spring and you see those leaves, they're already damaged. And some of them can be very significantly damaged because the nematode is feeding over the winter time. We can extract live nematodes even this time of year. We can go out in February, collect these leaves and buds, bring them in, they'll swim out. So they're overwintering in those buds for sure. So we know that once they're in the tree, they're moving around that way. How they're moving from tree to tree and forest to forest is an open question. Some people have suggested it might be an insect. Ambrosia beetles could be moving things around. It's possible that they're moving around with birds. So birds could be eating buds, and then they ingest those nematodes. And then as they defecate, some of those eggs are live nematodes that you don't need too many to survive the intestinal passage, right? They could then, as they defecate, be transporting them from forest to forest and from tree to tree. So we're doing some work with the Forest Service now, supporting a project looking at or looking for the presence of nematodes in bird poop. So sort of capturing birds and then looking to see if we can find the nematodes in bird poop. So that might be a way that they're moving around as well. So the vector is still a little uncertain, but once it's established in the tree, we know that they're moving from the leaves to the buds in the fall, and then they overwinter, and then they're there in the spring for you.
What year do beech trees begin producing seed?
I think they produce seed starting around 40 years.
Wow.
About 40 years. So it takes a little while. So those trees this tree here in this last slide is also at Lower Baldwin. This is not a disease tree. It's just showing some fall foliage. But none of these trees are probably about 15 years old or so. That's in terms of how long they've been at that plantation. They were in pots before that. So, but none of them are producing seed at this point. So we do have some Japanese beech that are probably about 25 years old that do produce a few seed, but generally about 40 years for a tree to really start producing seed.
Wow. Okay, we are losing almost 100% of our ash trees in central New York to EAB. What's a recommended tree to replace them?
Great question. I guess it would depend upon whether it's a forest or if it's a street tree. As a street tree, I would think there's some resistant elm right now. So Princeton elm, I think, is a resistant cultivar of elm that could be used as a street tree. So that might be a good replacement in an urban environment. So we do here at Holden have a community forestry program that's produced a tree selection guide, which you can find on our website. And it is really kind of specific for Northeast Ohio, but I think it really does work within the Great Lakes region and probably would be useful even for central New York. So if you go to our website and you look for the tree selection guide, it provides recommendations for anybody who might want to plant trees within their yard or their community, or even within their forest, if you have a forest in your yard. And that will give you some sense as to what might be the best tree to plant in terms of your size and whether you want pollinators and fall foliage and things like that. But I would say offhand, Princeton elm would be a good choice.
Okay. With beeches, hemlocks, ashes, and oaks all suffering from a variety of diseases, do you anticipate major changes in Ohio forests, especially as climate change intensifies?
Yeah, it's a big concern, right? So we have all of these trees are facing problems, and climate change is just layered on top of it. So we have pests and diseases, and we have climate change. So, so yes, we're starting to see some of these effects of the loss of beech with our forests here. As those mature beech trees start to die, we're seeing much more light. We're seeing a lot more sunlight hitting the canopy floor. That's going to change the forest wildflower communities. Also, increased temperature on the forest floor, which could affect all those other critters that live within the soil or within the duff layer. So yeah, expecting really large changes, I think, in many respects. We do have other trees that will kind of take their place. Things like tulip, for example, tulip poplar will come in and take the place. But what we're losing, I think, and the real concern with the loss of something like beech is that you're losing all those seeds. So even if you have another tree come in like tulip poplar or sugar maple, they don't provide the same resource to wildlife. And that's really the problem and the concern. So hickory could take the place of many of these beech in places, shagbark hickory is a component of many of our forests here. And so that does produce nuts that could be important for wildlife. But yeah, it's a real concern that these forests are going to change, and we're going to see changes with wildlife as well. So I think it kind of emphasizes the importance of doing some of this breeding and resistance work to try to develop plants that can be used for restoration that are resistant to the pests and diseases, at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's someone that has 2 European beeches, weeping purple and a yellow leaved. Do they look for the same marks on their leaves of those trees?
Yeah, we're seeing the same sort of pattern. So you'll see the same sort of dark interveinal banding, and eventually leaves get leathery and shrunken. And that's what we're seeing within our collections here. So our natural areas, of course, it's American beech, but the Arboretum has a very large plant collection from all over the world. So we're seeing European and Oriental beech affected here in our collections. So yeah, similar patterns of damage.
So here's someone that has read that green ash seems to be resistant. Can you provide any additional information on that?
I'm not sure. I'm under the impression that emerald ash borer affects all species of ash, but that would be a great question for Rachel Kapler, because she would know. But my impression is that it affects all species of ash. So green ash would be affected as well.
Okay. And even like new sprouts of ash can be affected, right?
Yeah, I think once they become a certain size, right? So we have, as part of our ash program with the Forest Service, we have 450 ash trees planted behind our building here that are all potentially resistant to emerald ash borer. And so we monitor them every year. But when they're really small, right, they're not attractive for that borer, right? Because it's not going to be able to get in there and really cause enough, it's not going to be able to get enough sustenance in order to, really make it worth its while, if you will. So they really need to get to a certain size before they become attractive to the insects. And if they're really small, so you do go through natural areas and see lots of really small ash still, right? So, and so that's a good thing that those ash are still there, even if they're really, really small. But as they become larger, they might become attractive to emerald ash borer. And so that we'll see how that plays out over time.
Here's an interesting question that we all should be thinking about. Can we spread some of these pathogens around on our hiking boots?
It's possible. I mean, we see beech leaf, we see the nematode that causes beech leaf disease, for example, in buds and leaves. We can detect it in leaf litter. So it's possible as those leaves fall in autumn and they're on the forest floor that you could pick some of that up and move it around with you if you go from place to place. So it really does kind of highlight the importance to clean your boots after a walk and before you go to another location. So yeah, I think that's probably a good policy with all kinds of things.
No kidding. If a seedling beech is dug from a forest, which shows evidence of beech leaf disease, will that seedling end up having beech leaf disease?
Yeah, so if it has beech leaf disease, on it as a seedling, then it will probably continue to have it as it grows. So even if you dig it up and move it, it will continue to have it. Now I will tell you that one of the reasons that I think that water is really important is because we've done those experiments in our greenhouse where inoculate the buds, healthy trees, and they have beech leaf disease and the nematodes are present. in our greenhouse, the leaves never get wet, so we always pot water them. So at the end of the year, when those trees go dormant and the leaves fall, it basically eliminates beech leaf disease from the tree because the leaves are never wet and the nematodes can't get out of the leaf and swim to the bud. So that's one of the reasons why I think that water is so important. So if you did have a seedling like that, and you brought it into your garage or something like that, and or you had a poly house, you kept it in there for a while, watered it in the pot, then eventually you could potentially purge it of the nematode. But as soon as you plant it back out into the forest, it's likely to become affected again. So especially if beech leaf disease is prevalent in your area.
Okay. Beech prolifically sprout from the roots when stressed. When a large beech is infected with beech leaf disease, how quickly does this disease kill these root sprouts?
Well,
do these individuals have a chance?
Yeah, actually, the root sprouts are the thing that we see affected first.
Okay.
So when we go through our natural areas and we look at beech leaf disease, those root sprouts are actually the ones that are showing the signs of beech leaf disease first, and are often the ones that are dying back first. And the reason for that is that they're in the lower part of the canopy. It's dark, it's shady, and it tends to be more moist. And that's what the nematode likes. It likes it moist and it likes it dim. So anything in the subcanopy layer tends to, including those sprouts, tends to be affected first. And then the canopy is affected later because it's, you think about it, it's up there in the sunlight, right? So those leaves and buds up in the sunlight, getting good air circulation, the sun dries them out. So the nematode, it's not a great environment for the nematode. So it's really the subcanopy and those root sprouts that are affected first. So that's what we see dying first. And then later on, you'll see more of an effect on the canopy of the tree itself. So unfortunately, those root sprouts won't really help the tree survive within the forests. And sometimes you think about American chestnut, right? Chestnut dies back and then you send up the root sprout. So it kind of maintains itself to a degree, right? Even though it can't really become a large tree. But this seems to be affecting those root sprouts in the subcanopy first.
Okay.
Later,
and that question actually did reference the American chestnut tree.
Yeah. So yeah. Unfortunately, it's kind of the reverse.
It is the reverse. So that's another thing someone asked. Do you have any update on how American chestnut trees are doing?
Same as before. So they're here. So we still have stump sprouts. They're present within our forests. But then once they become of a certain size, they begin to die back again from chestnut blight. So they never really get very large, and then they'll die back, and then they begin to sprout again. So so it's about the same. There's a lot of effort, obviously, at trying to breed chestnuts that are resistant to chestnut blight. And it seems like they've had some success doing that and beginning to distribute chestnuts more widely. But in terms of the native chestnuts we have in our forests, it's sort of the same story.
Okay. And the last question here, years ago, this person had heard of a beetle that was being introduced to predate on the hemlock woolly adelgid. Have you heard any results from this?
I have not. So certainly biocontrol is something that you can look at. Biocontrol can be successful in some instances, but it's tricky, right? So you're generally bringing in an insect from the native range of the pest. And so then you have to test it and make sure that it's not going to eat other things that you are interested in keeping on your landscape, right? So if it's really specific for hemlock woolly adelgid, it might be a winner. But if it could also eat, ladybird beetle larvae on the side, maybe it's not something you want to introduce. So there's a lot of testing that goes into biocontrol. So I know they've been working on it, but I don't know the status of that. Our work has been focused more on trying to select for resistance to the insects.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David.
Right. Great. It was my pleasure. And thanks for inviting me.
You betcha. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Hi, Heather.
Hi, Renee.
Hi. Well, it's 3 o'clock, so we're going to get
We're gonna keep rolling.
going with your program. Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Heather Holm. She's an author and biologist, and today she will be presenting Selecting Native Trees and Shrubs that Support Pollinators. So welcome, Heather.
Thanks, Renee. Just share my screen when you're ready.
Let me stop mine. You go ahead there.
All right. All right. Hi, everybody.
Lovely.
I just hold on a couple more settings here. Well, it's a pleasure to be here in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of winter. I know we're all anxiously awaiting for spring, so hopefully we can dream of spring during this presentation. And as Renee said, I'll be talking specifically about native woody plants, trees and shrubs that support pollinators. I'm going to largely focus on bee-plant interactions, but I'll also mention some of the other values that some of these woody plants provide. So we're going to start off just by touching on what is the difference between an insect pollinated or a wind pollinated tree or shrub. What are the primary candidates regarding bee genera that may be visiting some of these primarily spring flowering plants? And then I'll just sort of go through the different sizes of woody plants, starting with large canopy trees, and then working our way down into smaller shrubs. So, and then I'll just finish off with a few tips and tools for everybody to think about, like, how can we start incorporating some of these native trees and shrubs into our various types of landscapes. So tree pollination. So this picture I took at a local park several years ago, and the trees in this photo are primarily oak. And so that first sort of green haze that we often associate with leaves coming out on trees in spring is in fact the flowers of many of our wind pollinated trees. So the vast majority of deciduous trees in the temperate region, whether you live in the Midwest or Southern Great Lakes or Northeast or even Mid-Atlantic, most of the deciduous trees are wind pollinated. So what they are doing is flowering first before the leaves come out on the trees so that they can get their copious amount of pollen that they produce dispersed by wind. So these trees are largely not visited by flower visiting insects, but I'll touch a little bit on that a little bit more as we go through the presentation. So if we compare, so if we look at sort of why insects largely ignore wind pollinated trees, the flowers simply aren't doing a whole lot to attract insects. And in many cases, these wind pollinated trees are producing pollen less often or rarely nectar well before native bee emergence. So you can see the picture of this oak flowers. They're dull green, they're not showy, they lack fragrance. Most of these flowers don't produce nectar, but they are, as I mentioned, producing a ton of pollen, but it's tiny, dry, dusty pollen that's going to get easily picked up by the wind. And then often these woody plants have separate female and male plants. So it's a lot more work for a pollinator to go to one sex of one tree to collect pollen and then go to another sex of another same species to get nectar. So these are just some examples on the slide of common genera that are wind pollinated trees. Now, if we compare that to the minority of deciduous trees that are insect pollinated, the flowers are much different. They're a little bit more colorful, they're showy. They will either have well-developed sepals or petals. They are producing fragrance in some cases, such as that American basswood. The flowers are producing nectar. And in many cases, the flowers are bisexual. So they have all of the both the male and female reproductive parts being produced on one flower. And so that's really just great way for these flowers to have these attractants, and that is luring in a variety of different insects that would be feeding on the floral resources and then dispersing the pollen and helping to pollinate trees. Now, we do have sort of a small minority, so we're getting down into size into the woody shrub level, and we do have a few examples in the upper latitudes of some wind pollinated plants. And the one I have on this slide is American hazelnut. If you have that growing in your yard, you're familiar with the long male catkins that develop in early spring. Same strategy, long before the leaves come out. Here where I live in Minnesota, American hazelnut is blooming sometimes in early April. And so you see that those catkins develop, the pollen gets produced, and then it gets dispersed by the wind. So the receptive stigmas, the female flowers, the stigmas, as you can see in this picture, are bright red and separated from the male parts of the flower. But most of our deciduous shrubs that we're growing in our gardens have the typical showy flowers. The example here is black chokeberry, and that would be something that is has all the right things to draw in insects and is insect pollinated. So if we look at tree and shrub pollination through the season, or sort of the phenological view, as I mentioned, a lot of those wind pollinated trees are really starting to produce pollen to get dispersed by the wind really in early spring. Insect pollinated trees tend to be a little bit later, as I mentioned, that has to overlap with when the insect pollinators are out and active. And then often the shrubs kind of come into play later in the season. So we're not, if we were to compare this to a chart of herbaceous plants, we're not getting as much sort of consistent or solid phenological carryover, a continuous succession of flowering plants with woody species, but you can see here how important the spring and early summer is. So if we overlay that with the seasonal activity of our native bees, you can see that early part in spring, native bees simply aren't active when many of those trees that I mentioned, elm, silver maple, for example, ash, are blooming and producing pollen. So they're largely overlapping with the onset of these insect pollinated trees and insect pollinated shrubs. So bees, of course, we have 3,600 species in North America, north of Mexico, hundreds of species in any given state. And bees, of course, are essentially vegetarian. They're getting their nutrition from plant-based resources that are produced on the flower, pollen and nectar. Pollen is their protein, nectar, their source of carbohydrates. Female bees are doing all the work of establishing a nest and visiting flowering plants to collect both pollen and nectar. It's the combination of those two flower resources that they are depositing in a prepared brood cell to feed their offspring. So the females have the differences between a male and female is the female bees have different types of pollen collecting structures in order to pack and carry pollen back to their nests. We also have a small subset, or sometimes between 25 and 33%, so 1/4 to 1/3 of the total number of native bee species are pollen specialists. So if you're tuning in from Ohio, which I would imagine many of you are today, 25% of the native bees that occur in Ohio are pollen specialists. So what that means is the female collects only pollen from a single plant family, or it could be a little bit more narrow, a plant genus. So I'll highlight a few native shrubs in particular that attract various numbers of these pollen specialists. So if we look at spring tree and shrub pollination and what native bees are the primary players, I'll call it. I'm going to just feature a few genera to start with. So bumblebees, 90% of our native bees have solitary nests. The remaining 10% include our bumblebee species in North America in addition to some of our sweat bees, bees in the Halictus and Lasioglossum genus in particular have varying degrees of sociality, and some have truly social nests. But bumblebees compared to honeybees have very small social colonies. Their colonies are also annual, and they are producing anywhere from a few hundred to several hundred bumblebees in the growing season. But what makes them special and important and excellent and efficient pollinators is because they have 100% overlap in that season-long flowering phenology. So you're going to find new queens emerging from their hibernation site in early spring, visiting some of the first flowering shrubs and trees to bloom in order to either feed on nectar or to begin collecting pollen if they've already established a nest. And then as they produce broods of workers, followed by males as this growing season continues, there's many different foraging bumblebees out in the landscape visiting these various flowering woody plants. The other big genus that is a primary player in spring tree and shrub pollination is our bees in the genus Andrena. The common name for these bees are mining bees, and they are anywhere from sort of what I'd say medium sized, maybe honeybee sized to a little bit smaller. The females have, in particular, have very prominent depressions on the inside of their compound eyes. So if you look at that picture I have featured on the slide, she has almost like white vertical stripes on her face, and that's a characteristic of the genus. And they sort of complement bumblebees. Bumblebees will pass over really delicate spring flowering woodland ephemerals in some cases, but mining bees will often visit some of those flowering plants that bumblebees pass over. But you will find them on many different flowering trees and shrubs in early spring. We have a pretty large diversity of species in this genus, and most of them are spring active. So if you're going to be finding a mining bee out in the landscape, it would likely be in the spring. The other big player are bees in the cellophane genus, Calides. There's this species that I have pictured on the slide is the unequal cellophane bee. It's often the first bee species to emerge in spring. Here in Minnesota, I see them typically at the end of March. So if you live farther south, then you'll see them even a little bit earlier. And they, like mining bees, are ground nesting. The females build solitary nests. So they are out and active right at the onset of some of the flowering of the first native trees and shrubs. That's a female pictured on pussy willow. And here in Minnesota, pussy willow is usually one of the first woody species to bloom. The other sort of major or minor player in spring pollination are bees in the Osmia genus, mason bees. This is a picture of a male orchard mason bee visiting a flowering red maple. And the females may not overlap with the flowering of red maple, but the males do because they emerge earlier than the females, and that is the case for all solitary bees. And these bees, unlike the other two solitary bee genera I just talked about, nest above ground in pre-existing cavities. So the females would be looking for places such as holes in cavities in wood or any other opportunities that generally have a horizontal orientation. All right, so if we look at a spring flowering tree, so again, I'm thinking of how can I get every single homeowner in this country to plant something, at least one plant for pollinators. We often forget about how a single flowering tree really has what I call vertical flower power. So this is a picture of a flowering black cherry tree. The tree, can be 60, 70 feet tall and just absolutely covered in flowers. So if we were to compare that, for example, to someone planting the equivalent size perennial garden, this would equal something like a 3,500 square foot perennial garden. So for those folks that aren't necessarily gardeners or want to do a whole lot of work in their landscape, why not help influence them to plant an insect pollinated tree? And we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the presentation about ways that we can get some of these interesting and wonderful insect pollinated trees into our landscapes. So we'll go through, as I said, sort of starting off with the taller tree canopy species, and then work our way down to tall trees or large shrubs or small trees, large shrubs, and then finishing off with small shrubs. So we're going from big to or tall to short as we go through these slides. So maples, if you notice back on one of my initial slides, I had a little asterisk next to maples, and we have many different maple species in the northern US. I just have several listed on this slide. What's unusual about maples is some of them are very early flowering. So the silver maple and maybe not the most desirable box elder trees do bloom quite early, usually or almost always before native bee emergence. So those maple species are wind pollinated. And then we sort of, some species are sort of straddling that wind and insect pollination. So sugar maple is an example where in some growing seasons, it may receive visits by flower visiting insects, depending on native bee emergence, but in most cases, sugar maple is generally a wind pollinated maple. And then some of the later blooming maples, including red maple, and if you're living more in northern Michigan or northern Minnesota, mountain maple is also an insect pollinated maple. So if we look at red maple as almost sort of the most appropriate maple for, I'm assuming, for where everybody's tuning in today, and it's a little bit counterintuitive because some of you may know that red flowers, many of our flower visiting insects are red blind. So, but red maple flowers are still attractive because they have ultraviolet markings. And here in Minnesota, red maple is the first deciduous tree to bloom. So I always try and find a newly planted red maple that's maybe 15 to 20 feet tall that I can get up on a ladder and observe all the different flower visiting insects. And red maples generally grow in natural habitats in moist situations, cool north-facing slopes. They can be an issue in certain types of ecological restoration targets, but if from a forestry or community forestry perspective, there are a number of excellent types of red maples that we can include in our residential landscapes. And as you can see, because it's the only game in town in some situations, it's attracting a number of different flower visiting insects. And back to that early emerging cellophane bee, this is just an example how bees need very specific things to fulfill their habitat needs. So that early emerging cellophane bee needs to nest in the ground in extremely sandy soil. This is a little prairie in a park near where I live. And so there's a large population of cellophane bees that nest generally in this same area in this prairie each spring. You can see the nests are lined up along that footpath. So each individual female is excavating her own nest, but because of the soil type and conditions are ideal, many females will nest together in aggregations. And the other part of their habitat need is that the females primarily visit red maple trees because they're the earliest emerging species. They need to nest fairly close to where red maples occur. So even though this fairly small park has not only a sandy prairie, it also has a wooded ridge where red maples grow on the east and north facing slopes. So it's a short flight distance for the females to head on over to the red maples, collect the pollen and nectar that they initially need so that they can start provisioning their nests. This is a video, it probably won't play well, but what it is illustrating is the flowering of red maple. Hopefully you can at least see the bees flying around. And these bees are not landing on the flowers. And so these are primarily the male cellophane bees, and males generally hedge their bets. They either, if they're a ground nesting species, they either hang out around the nesting site waiting for females to emerge so they have an opportunity to mate with them, or because really the red maple is the only thing blooming for this species, the males head off to a red maple tree, fly around and wait for the females to come to the red maple in order for them to have an opportunity to mate with them. All right, so looking at other canopy trees, tulip poplar, more of a mid-Atlantic tree species, but also occurring north of that area as well. It's kind of unusual. It's a very primitive magnolia-like flower, and the orange markings on the inside of the sepals are actually where the nectar is produced. So the nectar is exuded from those orange markings. It sort of flows in pools into the bottom of the flower. And then the flower visiting insects have to crawl under that whorl of stamens in order to feed on the nectar. The flowers are self-incompatible, meaning that they require cross-pollination. And with many flowering plants, they have a sequence of producing male reproductive parts first, followed by female. So the plant would likely produce nectar just as it opens, attracting insects right at the point in time where the flower is shedding pollen grains, and then those pollen grains would be transferred by flower visiting insects to another tulip poplar flower. Black cherry, so this is an example of a tree species in the Prunus genus, in the rose family. And unlike the red maple that generally flowers before the leaves emerge, black cherry flowers develop after the leaves have emerged. So the flowers have long white flower racemes covered by white 5-petaled, very fragrant flowers. This black cherry trees are primarily visited by bees in the mining bee genus. I generally don't see bumblebees visiting black cherry trees, but many of you probably already know it's also looking at it from the butterfly and moth standpoint. Plants in the Prunus genus are considered keystone species, so they are larval host plants for a large diversity of butterflies and moths. So even though those two insect groups may not be the primary pollinator, you're getting not only providing flowering plants for pollinators such as bees, but also a very viable larval host plant. American basswood is kind of the odd one out of that flowering phenology sequence that I showed with flowering trees. And it actually blooms in the middle of summer, which is quite odd. But the flowers are extremely fragrant. They're pendulous in clusters. Like I mentioned with the flower development sequence, the flowers produce pollen first, followed by nectar. A study out of Michigan found that the primary pollinator of American basswood were nocturnal moths. And this is an example of a plant that has what we would call a 24-hour nectar production cycle. So the plant actually starts to ramp up nectar production in late afternoon, just so that the nectar stores are full right at the point in time when nocturnal moths emerge. So given that nocturnal moths rely on light colored flowers in order to be able to see them, in addition to fragrance, that makes a lot of sense. But during the day, you will also see bumblebees in addition to honeybees visiting American basswood flowers. All right, Ohio buckeye. So I have a yellow buckeye species that 2 homeowners previous to me living in this house planted, and that's an Appalachian buckeye. But what I always notice with that buckeye tree blooming in around late April, beginning of May, is that I don't see any pollinators on the ground, even though I have a large diversity of different flowering plants blooming in the spring, because all of the bumblebees in particular are up in the buckeye tree, busy pollinating those flowers. So this is an excellent plant for not only bumblebees, but also the migratory hummingbirds that are coming from the south. And generally they're arriving through the area when buckeye trees begin to bloom. So I hopefully this talk reminds you that this spring, don't forget to look up, because often a lot of the pollinator activity is happening up in these insect pollinated trees. Okay, we'll get kind of moving down in size. So this is another plant in the Prunus genus, the cherries and plums, called wild plum, or also American plum, extremely fragrant flowers. This plant I call a pollinator palooza, or a lawn chair plant, where what I mean is get out the lawn chair and sit next to it when it's blooming, because it will attract a variety of different insects. Some of the early butterfly species that may be migrating from a few states south of you will be visiting the flowers. Many different kinds of bees, flower visiting flies, beetles. The flowers, like all plants in the Prunus genus, are self-incompatible. So that means that they require cross-pollination. And so you can see the plant is employing a number of strategies, blooming when it doesn't have too much competition, producing a lot of fragrance, and good floral rewards to draw in this large variety of insects. The service berries often are blooming in early spring, depending on when you live. And thankfully, we have a variety of different service berries to choose from that are appropriate for different conditions. So just make sure if you are planting a service berry, you match it to it's native to your area, and it also matches the growing conditions that you have in your yard. People really like service berries for their ornamental qualities. Smooth gray bark, often a multi-stem form, and what horticulturalists call 3 seasons of interest, because spring bloom and the production of edible fruit for both birds and humans, and then sort of a red fall color. Now, the thing with insect pollination and visitation to serviceberry flowers is it can be really hit or miss. So depending on the growing season and weather conditions, those white petals are really delicate. If we have cold or windy or heavy rains in early spring, just when that serviceberry is blooming, it can quite literally blow off the flowers. So, and the other thing is serviceberries often co-flowering with other more attractive flowering plants. So you may see high visitation rates in some growing seasons, and then the next year you don't see a whole lot of activity. But a lot of the small and medium-sized native bees particularly will visit serviceberry while it's in bloom. Now, willows, it's a little bit more difficult to find appropriate willows for a home landscape situation, but I absolutely encourage everybody tuning in to find a patch, a park or a local natural area where willows occur, and go out there first thing in the spring when the first plants start to bloom, and you will be amazed at the activity that you find around willow. The willow I have featured here is pussy willow. So some people can successfully grow that in their home garden, although it really likes rather moist conditions, and in natural habitats grows on wetland edges. There's also a prairie willow, Salix humulus, and it's a much shorter willow. It's still sort of clonal and will be a spreading willow, but it tolerates much drier conditions. What's important about willow is one of the first species to bloom in spring, so really critical for pollinators such as those new bumblebee queens emerging from hibernation. The other really important thing is we have a number of native bees that specialize on collecting willow pollen. So willows are kind of unusual. They They act like they're a wind-pollinated species having separate male and female plants, but all of the willows occurring in Eastern North America are generally insect pollinated. And the floral resources are extremely nutritious. So the protein content in willow pollen is 40%. If you compare that to dandelions, for example, dandelion protein content is 15%. So if you can find a place, an appropriate willow native to your area, I really encourage you to try growing one. So number of specialists, 14 monolectic specialists, which are the really strict or narrow specialists. So 14 species of different native bees, primarily in the mining bee Andrena genus. The females collect only willow pollen. And many of those specialists who featured here, they just both happen to have red abdomens. The females, again, going back to those specific habitat needs, the females like to nest in loose but somewhat compacted sand. So they need to have an area where there's a bare sandy area close to where an adequate supply of willows are blooming. And if you are a willow, if you're able to ID willows, I'm still working on that. The local park, even, for example, has 6 or 7 species. But even having that many species along a wetland, they provide a really nice flowering phenology of 6 to 8 weeks. So these females are busy excavating their nests in loose compacted sand. They don't want to fly very far, a couple hundred yards at the most, to find their host plants and return to their nests with those pollen collecting structures absolutely loaded down with pollen. All right, other large shrubs / small trees, redbud. So if you have redbud native to where you grow, it's an excellent pollinator plant. It's in the pea families, and flowering plants generally in the pea family are very good pollen sources, and some of them are nectarless, but many produce both pollen and nectar. So you will find those bee genera that I mentioned earlier, bees such as the cellophane bees, orchard mason bees, bumblebees, visiting redbud. Redbuds like light, so you'll find them in sort of trying to grow on the edges of forests in natural habitats, maybe forests that were once more open. And so this is a nice tree, small tree or large shrub to incorporate into a home landscape. Okay, this is the last one I'll feature in the Prunus genus, but for those of you that are maybe have a wooded area that you own on part of your property, and maybe you're removing invasive plants and looking for alternative understory shrubs, chokecherry can often be a good candidate if it's regionally native to where you live. The flowers are pretty much identical to the black cherry tree, so long white flower racemes. They are also self-incompatible, so they need cross-pollination. I typically find generally mining bees and sweat bees are the primary visitors of chokecherry, but that may differ by region. And the chokecherry is fairly shade tolerant. So here in Minnesota, our primary invasive plant invading woodlands and savannas is a European buckthorn. So this is often recommended as a replacement plant, particularly in a home landscape where people lose that screening that they really like after they remove invasive plants and want to sort of replace how open it is after they have done so. Okay, the dogwoods, I know dogwoods have various disease issues depending on where you live. So if that is the case, maybe this isn't the best choice, but we all have a number of different dogwoods to choose from if they do grow well. And just featuring one here, the pagoda or alternate leaved dogwood, which I think has the most interesting form, the horizontal branching habit. Again, a plant with 3 seasons of interest: spring bloom, fall red color, sometimes burgundy or maroon, and then the flowers produce, if pollinated, produce blueberries, which are sought after by birds. Dogwoods also support pollen collecting specialists. There are 4 species that are strict specialists of pollen, dogwood pollen, and one featured here, the short-haired dogwood mining bee, which I regularly find on roundleaf dogwood that I have growing in my garden. So hopefully this gives you some tips and tools of looking a little bit more closely at what are the different flower visiting insects, and in particular bee species that are visiting your dogwood flowers. Sumac, I know may not be a desirable plant for a home landscape, but if we think about, from the 50,000 foot view, how do we get more pollinator habitat back into spaces such as roadsides, railway right-of-ways? The sumac, can you imagine how easy it is to grow? Quite literally, you can rip some out of the ground and move it and replant it, and it will grow without much care. So I look at these early successional species like sumac as an opportunity, and we could easily start planting clusters of sumac on roadside, because they do provide both pollen and nectar, attract a really wide variety of flower visiting insects, and as I said, very easy to grow. Plant it and quite literally walk away. The stems of sumac as well, it's kind of a softwood plant and has a pith-filled center. So if those stems are browsed by herbivores such as deer or rabbits, those stems can become very good nesting cavities for a number of our cavity nesting bees. Oops, I'm just gonna drop out here. I've got a weird panel that showed up on my slide. All right, this is one of my favorite sort of delicate ornamental understory native shrubs. This picture is in my home garden. The plant is American bladdernut. It is a multi-stemmed sort of upright form. It flowers later in the spring, and the flowers kind of look like blueberry flowers. They're bell-shaped. They hang downward in clusters. I find some of the first social wasp queens coming out of hibernation visiting the plant, in addition to bumblebees as well as mining bees. The plant does spread and produce sort of that multi-stem cluster gets larger and larger over time. It will get browsed by rabbits when it's young, but after it develops sort of a woody texture, the herbivores tend to ignore it. Another self-incompatible plant, but what's unusual is the female reproductive parts of the flower develop first prior to the male reproductive parts, so it's protogynous. Most plants are protandrous rather. But this plant I find growing in oak woodlands, sort of more open woodlands, maybe with 40 to 60% tree cover. So if you're living where you have a closed canopy deciduous forest, then that would likely be too shady for this large shrub. All right, so finishing off, getting into smaller cultivated as well as wild type native shrubs. Black chokeberry is really largely available now thanks to the horticultural industry. There are a number of cultivars. I still encourage you to try and purchase from your local native plant nursery to get a straight species. This is another flowering plant in the rose family. So the flowers are 5-petaled, and then what's fun is the anthers are bright pink, so that's likely the visual attractant for the bees and flies that like to visit the flower. Another plant with 3 seasons of interest, so spring bloom, the flowers produce clusters of dark blue to black berries. And then in the fall, the foliage will turn bright yellow. So this is pretty versatile plant. I've grown it in fairly dry situations just to test its tolerance. It generally likes it a little bit more moist or heavier or loamy soils. Buttonbush, this is a fun plant to grow if it's native to your area. The big white spherical flowers. And it flowers a little bit later in the summer. So sometimes after that flush of spring blooming native shrubs, this is just something that adds to maybe the flowering perennials that you already have blooming in your landscape. It's fun to watch bumblebees visit these flowers, particularly if they are females actively collecting pollen, because they will spin around really quickly around those spherical flowers as they have the pollen grains adhere to them. The flowers are really attractive to butterflies and moths. I've seen some wonderful photos that people have taken of, 3 or 4 or 6 monarch butterflies visiting their butterfly bush. It can get really big. Mature butterfly bushes can get 12, 15 feet tall. They generally keep their rounded form, but just keep that in mind. They, in natural areas, they tend to grow in more moisture situations along wetland edges. But I have this picture I took in North Carolina growing in heavy clay soil, and they were doing fine in that situation. So I'm also sort of testing here where I live the tolerances of buttonbush to see where the plant can and cannot grow. Another flowering shrub in the rose family, so 9-bark. If you travel around Lake Superior or some of the other Great Lakes, you'll see this plant as one tough customer. I've seen it growing out of the cracks of rocks around the Great Lakes. It is very attractive to bees and wasps, flies, in addition to butterflies. So some of those early butterfly species, such as red admiral, you'll find them visiting 9-bark. 9-bark, there are a number of cultivars, some with maroon or reddish foliage. Again, try and find the straight species which has the green foliage. Keep in mind and learn about 9-bark's form. The branches tend to be arching, and it's got a very broad habit. So make sure you have enough room. I've seen it used very nicely as a hedge. So people do a little bit of pruning to maintain it in more of a hedge form. But it's a wonderful spring flowering plant that is really tough. It can tolerate some amazing situations, as I mentioned, cracks in the rocks. Okay, our wild roses. So if you can avoid buying any kind of cultivars or hybrid teas or double flowered form roses, and seek out a native rose. Now, native roses can spread, and so you need some room. They don't have this nice tidy habit that some of those cultivated roses do, but they are generally single petaled, and all of the native roses are nectarless. I have Carolina rose on this slide, but there's also the one I also like to use is smooth wild rose, Rosa blonda. And because the flowers are nectarless, that picture I have there, 3 different types of insects, flies, beetles, and bees are generally pollen feeding insects. So butterflies, wasps, for example, who typically don't seek out pollen, would avoid a flowering plant such as this. But because it's a pollen only plant, it's a really important pollen source for native bees active in the spring who are provisioning their nests. Same as the wild rose, plants in the Hypericum genus, this great St. John's worts, or just the St. John's worts, are also nectarless. And you can see the similarity if I go back to the previous slide, which I won't, but the open flower form and then that large whorl of stamens circling the middle of the flower. And that can often tell you it's a nectarless plant. But the other indication is if you're standing close to the flowering plant, and a lot of these nectarless plants that are pollen producing, the bees get up early in the morning, they visit these flowering plants, they extract the pollen, and then by midday, you won't see any pollinator activity. So these are what are called early morning plants. You have to get out and witness that pollen collection. But the thing that will also tell you that it's nectarless is many of our native bees will buzz pollinate nectarless plants. So you'll hear bumblebees, some of those smaller native bees I just had on the previous slide, like that metallic green sweat bee, you can actually hear them sonicating the pollen from the flowers. And bumblebees just seem to love Great St. John's wort or shrubby St. John's wort. They literally dive into the middle of the flower and they look like they're bathing in the flower's pollen. New Jersey tea is somewhat of a difficult plant to grow if you have high herbivore pressure. The rabbits absolutely love it, but it's an excellent plant if you have really well-drained soils, sandy soils. It grows in open, hot, dry prairies, as well as open savannas. The flowers attract a really wide variety of insects, both native bees, but I also think, when researching my wasp book, I found that this is one of the primary attractive plants for native solitary predatory wasps. So they really like the flowers' nectar. So if you want to sort of complement your planting to attract beneficial insects, this would be a good woody shrub to consider. Again, you would need to fence it if you have really big or large rabbit populations. All right, so where do we put these insect pollinated woody plants? So this is just a shot of a homeowner's house. The deciduous tree that they have planted in their front yard is the silver maple. So that's a wind pollinated tree. Their foundation shrub is an evergreen. So that's also wind pollinated. So this is quite literally a blank slate. And so I like to think about how can we convince folks that maybe aren't avid gardeners to incorporate some of these various insect pollinated trees and shrubs. So introducing a hedge along the side of the property, a hedge of 9-bark, for example. I like to do a mixed shrub planting for birds. So mixing some dogwoods and viburnums and other sort of medium height shrub species provides some cover for nesting birds. Those shrubs produce fruit for birds and also host a number of different insects that they need to feed their offspring. This homeowner could also just plant a second insect pollinated tree. And so what we would be doing in a neighborhood with this person's neighbors were active gardeners and had a lot of variety of flowering plants. This homeowner's yard now becomes a stepping stone, or what I call a gas station. Pollinators can move through the habitat much easier, fuel up on the woody plants that have been incorporated, and then move on down the street to maybe gardens that are offering a lot more resources. So shrub foundations around the planting are an easy redo for a homeowner such as this, just swapping out some of those shrubs or expanding the shrubs around the foundation. Most recently, a friend and I, who has a nonprofit, started a campaign to build on the work of Doug Tallamy, who talks a lot about keystone plants and the importance of larval host plants for butterflies and moths. And we decided, well, what happens when all of those caterpillars, whether they're moth or butterfly caterpillars, feeding on some of these keystone trees, such as oaks or cherries, what happens when they're ready to pupate? Well, many of them either crawl or drop to the ground under the tree. In the case of moths, they often will sort of burrow into the leaf litter or into the soil to prepare for pupation. And we thought, well, that doesn't work very well if your yard looks like that homeowner's yard with turf grass underneath. So I have handouts and plant recommendations on my author website, and I'll put that in the chat box at the end, but we came up with this campaign called Soft Landings. So even though it's not talking about planting woody species, we also have to think about what are we planting under these woody species to help support every stage of the life cycle of some of these beneficial insects. So native trees and shrubs really help provide that spring and early summer chunk in a continuous succession or flowering phenology that we all should be thinking about as gardeners. So we really want to have something blooming as soon as that first warm day in spring, all the way through to late fall. And often we sort of forget about spring and fall, the bookend parts, because so much is going on in the summer. Usually so many things are blooming. So if everybody can kind of focus on how can I get more spring and fall blooming plants in the landscape, that's really going to help round out this flowering phenology that is needed for all of the different native pollinators. We also have to forget about using pesticides if we're doing all this work to plant pollinator habitat, have to build up some tolerances. It's okay if insects are eating the foliage of your plants. And often, many cases, it's really just cosmetic damage. So if we can all just leave the pesticides on the shelf, particularly if we're planting a garden such as this on the slide, we don't want to create all this pollinator habitat and then lure them in and then have poisonous chemicals on the plants. So build up some tolerances, continue to connect with your local extension office for anything that seems a little bit more concerning than cosmetic damage, but err on the side of caution before being reactionary. And so if we all have a carefully planned garden that includes not only a variety of different flowering trees and shrubs, it really can be easier to maintain. Going back to that homeowner's blank slate, adding another tree and some additional shrubs around the foundation won't really cramp that homeowner's landscape management style. They won't have to mow any more or less. They simply just have to do a little bit of work to do some planting. So that's where I think we can start with a lot of people who aren't interested in intensive gardening. This is where woody plants can really play a really great role. So with that, I will pass it over to Renee, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, my website there is under the handouts word, and I have a specific handout called Trees and Shrubs for Pollinators. Features many of the species I covered today and more, and that's all my handouts on the website are free to download.
Thank you, Heather. And thanks for the links there. That's wonderful. A lot of people have been asking about that. So I'm going to jump into some questions. Here's someone that wants to plant American plum and elderberry bushes. She's asking, how many do I need to plant in order for them to produce fruit? I live in the Cleveland region.
Yeah, so with American plum, you just need at a minimum two for that cross-pollination to occur. But if you can squeeze in 3 or 4, that would be great. But
Okay.
two is the minimum, just to get that pollen getting transferred from one plant to the other to achieve cross-pollination. I like to plant wild plum kind of in clusters because it is a little bit thorny. It will root sucker, so it's not what you would think of as a specimen small tree that you plant in the middle of your lawn. You want to think of it more as a habitat thicket. So hopefully that helps. Generally, I plant things in 3s and just make sure you get the spacing right for the mature size of the plant.
Great. What gardening practices can harm or help ground nesting bees?
Well, ground nesting bees, depending on when the female is actively nesting, any kind of disturbance such as tilling soil or digging can be disruptive during the nesting season. Many native bees have, fairly deep nests. So if you were just digging in small pot-sized plants to plant after nesting had finished, you likely wouldn't be impacting the developing larvae in the nest. But we do have some shallow nesting native bees. One example is the native squash bee. They generally nest very close to their host plant, squash or pumpkin, and their nest can be extremely shallow, 5 inches, for example. So if you usually I just say be observant. If you see active nesting activity, that means you may need to hold off doing work or gardening in that area for 3 or 4 weeks, and then the females will finish up their nesting activities. The larvae will be developing in the ground, and generally some sort of superficial work won't impact them.
Okay. For your soft landings, do you recommend mulch under the trees or just leaving the leaves as compost?
Yeah, the soft landings, we recommend the leaves that the shade tree produces, or you could even add additional leaves raked from other areas of your yard. And then eventually, once those flowering perennials that you have, and sedges and grasses you have incorporated as a planting under the tree, when you chop that material down, you can let that plant material debris be part of the natural material layer, I will call it. I'm starting to completely avoid using mulch at all. I used to use mulch just on footpaths, but because of the concern over the invasive jumping worms being transported in both bulk and bagged mulch, I'm really steering clear of using mulch anymore. So generally, we all have some leaf litter that we can use as a weed suppression layer, but the other thing is to plant more densely. So this picture is along my garage that I took several years ago, and you can see how densely planted those spring flowering plants are. So there really aren't any gaps for weeds to take hold, have enough light, and to germinate. So spend more money on plants rather than mulch would be my recommendation.
Okay, and when you're adding understory trees, shrubs, and flowers, can you recommend what people should be doing to protect the old existing tree when they're digging in those spaces?
Yeah, on the soft landings page and in the handout on my website, we have recommendations for taking care not to damage your tree. So just check that out, and it's included in the bigger 4-page handout if you scroll down a little bit farther on the page.
Okay. Now here's someone that's noticed a lot of bees on their 7 sunflower tree. What do you think about this tree for pollinators?
Boy, I'm not familiar with what the scientific name would be. Maybe someone can help me out. 7 sun.
I don't know either, so I was hoping
Okay.
you would another. So
hopefully someone will come
move
to the
on
rescue
from that one.
Yeah.
Oh, heptacodium.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that. It must
Okay.
be a southern species. Oh,
Asian. It's Asian.
oh, Asian. Okay.
Okay.
My
That's
world
why
kind
we
of
don't
is,
know it.
yeah, native plants, so I can't help too much on exotic
Okay, sounds
stuff.
good.
Sorry.
Here's someone that has 1 serviceberry tree. Will an additional tree increase flower formation and benefit the existing tree?
I would think so, even though I'd have to go back to my own slide to recall if
Okay.
it's self-incompatible or not. But yeah, having additional species clustered together is always going to help improve pollination. It's
Okay.
just, it's like, if you think about it, you have one flowering thing versus a bigger attractive cluster, that will help draw in more pollinators and move pollen around versus one. So
Okay. Here, can you root pussy willows from stem cuttings? And what is the best time of year to try?
sorry, I missed the beginning of that, Renee.
Can you root pussy willows from stem cuttings?
Oh yeah, you can
Okay.
do, yeah, willow is one of the easiest plants to do softwood cuttings from. So quite literally get your pruners out in the spring and clip it before the leaves emerge. And then you can stick that right into moist soil in its permanent location and have pretty good success. Yeah.
Okay. And let me see. Here's someone. Is pollen replenished on a flower, or is it a one-shot deal?
Well, it sort of depends on the plant, but the plant has a set number of stamens and anthers. The pollen grains are developed and produced and shed from each anther. So that can happen over a staggered period of time if you look at it from, a flower level. But no, it's not like the anther produces pollen, sheds, and then reproduces more pollen. That's not the case. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a one-shot deal, I would guess you would call it.
And here's one last question. What is the best time to clean out the holes in our bee houses? The ones with the cylindrical holes?
Oh, that's a tough question because it really depends on the occupants, right? So a lot of those bee houses provide nesting opportunities for spring nesting bees, like the mason bee I mentioned. So you want to, ideally you want to use liners. So paper liners that can be pulled out at any time, but usually really early spring, and then replaced with fresh liners. And then you can put those ones aside that still have either pre-pupa or adults ready to emerge in a safe place and an exit strategy for them. So that's what I recommend. Rather than trying to clean out a wood hole, you're going to likely damage some of the occupants. Even if you try and time it correctly, you just have to know who's living in there and what development stage they are at. Yeah.
Sure. And then someone did ask, are there any ground nesting bees that can live in seasonably wet ground conditions?
There are several. There's some interesting studies, even with nests that get flooded for quite a long period of time, but many ground nesting native bees employ different strategies to waterproof their nest. So that cellophane bee actually has a glandular secretion that the females exude from their abdomen, combine it with their saliva, and then they paint that on the soil wall, and that creates like a waterproof lining. So even if the surrounding soil becomes highly saturated, it doesn't usually penetrate into that brood cell to spoil the provisions or affect the larva.
Very neat. Well, thank you, Heather. And if
You're
we didn't
welcome.
get to your questions, we'll get to them after the session. And everyone have a wonderful day. Join us again in 2 weeks. We're going to have session 4, and it's going to be about developing better landscapes in the urban setting. So
All right.
I'll follow up to this with a link to register for that. And the recording of this will be available most likely tomorrow afternoon. So
Okay,
thank you. Yeah.